Hello, good morning. So in last class we had been talking about India-US relations, and we tried to make sense of a few things. What are these things? That perhaps this is the most complex relationship that we are talking about. Complex not because of necessarily the difficulties which may be there on positions. Complex because this is a relatively newer partnership for India and a relatively newer partnership even for the United States. So these are two countries which are in the phase of developing engagement, whereby the large part of their interaction has been shaped by their Cold War experience. And in the Cold War period, generally we see that despite the commonality of values, there was divergence in orientation. The way they looked at world politics and their own interests diverged. And we looked at some of the examples. So thereby different orientation in foreign policy developed. Thereby we can say that largely this relationship was undermined by distrust, right? So which were not founded on any particular differences between these two sides on bilateral matters, but largely on the way global politics, was structured in the Cold War period, which was characterized by features like bipolarity of the Cold War period, if you would remember. All right, bipolarity meaning USSR being two poles of global politics. Then we said that objective conditions change and thereby opportunities arise. So the objective conditions for this relationship started changing first of all with a structural change in global politics, that is the end of the Cold War. That is the end of bipolarity. So this period, as I said, is described as either unipolar movement, end of history by many. But in this period also we see that what exists is commonality of values. But then because of the long period of Cold War, India-US relations, before they acquire an upward trajectory, display certain frictions. For example, US have been close to Pakistan in its relations and approach. So on the issues of Jammu and Kashmir, or on the issue of terrorism, or on the issue of nuclear capabilities of India, there were differences. That's something that was characterized the decade of 1990s. And then we say that in this period also, India and US start engaging with each other in terms of dialogues, right? So it can be dialogue between Mr. Jaswant Singh and Strobe Talbot on nuclear issues after India's nuclear test and US sanctions. And that then is happening in a particular context. What is that context? The context is India's market in the phase of economic opening up is an attractive market for the Americans. B, India's achievements in some areas like IT services is attractive to the Americans. And C, on the larger strategic future, both of them had commonality in terms of they identifying China as a major part of either their threat perception or perception of competition. So these three factors drove the relations further in the post-Cold War period. And we see that resulted in, for example, 2004 strategic partnership agreement being signed, but before that 2000 President Clinton visiting India, and then 2004 President George W. Bush visiting India. And then we said that this is largely how we understand the gradual evolution of this relationship in the current form. And in that period, we took up one example, which is the example of the Indo-US civil nuclear deal, as an example of how we see characteristically the relations have drastically changed. So civil nuclear deal A is important in bilateral context as well as in the global context for India. And that also gives you an idea of the nature of relationship with United States, right? So we see civil nuclear agreement was accompanied by similar changes made in the US law by the US Congress, right? So that gives you the idea of nature of interactions between India and US. These are two complex democracies, and that's why sometimes delays in resolving issues. So this meant that India not only now is eligible to engage in civil nuclear trade with US, because this was an agreement with the US, But what happened simultaneously in this process allowed India to normalize itself in the larger technology trade, including nuclear technology. So what happened along with this? With the help of the US, we negotiated a waiver, one-time waiver from the NSG. Then we negotiated our own India-specific safeguards and signed a protocol of the IAEA. And that became the basis template for India's normalization in nuclear trade. So by that agreement, without signing the NPT, India now is eligible for global nuclear commerce, civilian nuclear commerce. And that's where we said that if this agreement is important, it is important because it is a sign of deepening of India-US relations, right? Secondly, it's an acknowledgement of India's credible track record in military issues, in nuclear issues, right? Third, the specific arguments regarding it providing India a clean energy option. Civil nuclear agreement provided India a clean energy option. And thereby, we also see that it helped India in ending its technology isolation, which we characterize simply by saying that India since then has become member of 3 MECRs, multilateral export control regimes. India is a member of Australia Group, Wassenaar Arrangement, and now the MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime as well. So that is only the example of how this relationship is complex and has transformed. All right, so even when something big is happening, it would take time because of these complex democracies and their relatively new experience of engaging with each other. And then we moved forward. And we moved forward and we started looking at each areas of engagement which characterize the relationship right now, which is referred to as comprehensive global strategic partnership. So we looked at economic engagements as a pillar of relations between these two sides. And we first characterized it by looking at the data, which is trade is high between India and United States, around 119 billion US dollars. 2, for India, US is the largest export market. 3, India enjoys a trade surplus with United States. All right. So that is something that we see in the case of India-US trade engagements consistently. That India has a trade surplus, India has a large export market there, and we saw that India and US don't have major arrangements like free trade agreement. All right. So thereby, there are issues. Any trading relationship would have certain issues. All right. These issues are either about challenges which may emerge in understanding, or challenges which may emerge in terms of expanding the scope of the relationship. All right. So issue, scope, and challenge or limitation. These are various ways of talking about one aspect of any relationship. So we saw that fundamental differences between India and US continue in the economic engagements. How so? Because on some issues they don't have commonality of perception. All right. So for example, in IPR, the differences are fundamental. Fundamental in terms of India and US right now are not in a position to change their approach that they have adopted. All right. And then we say that some of these issues, be it the issue of trade deficit by the US or market access by the US, acquire salience in particular times. For example, the transactional, which means short-term approach adopted by the Trump administration. So we say that for example, under Trump administration, US accused India of being a tariff king, high tariff country. US accused India of not allowing adequate, reasonable market access to its companies, or its intellectual property right holders not getting adequate market protection in India. All right, and thereby it was not only characterized by these issues which were already there, but also characterized by certain action that US took, which generally were detrimental for these relations. So one was withdrawing GSP preference from India, generalized system of preference from India, whereby India was the largest beneficiary of US GSP. All right, around 5 billion US dollars of trade qualified under that. And then we saw that US reclassified India out of its own developing countries list. And then we also saw that US in that particular period had adopted an approach whereby it resorted to increasing tariffs as a punitive measure against the countries with whom it had a trade deficit. So primarily targeting China, but also when the tariffs were raised in steel and aluminum, India is also affected, right? Not in a major way. So thereby then India decides to identify around 28 products from US to impose a tariff on. So that is something that India decides as a retaliatory measure, and India suspends for the time being the implementation of these tariffs. And then we hoped that through conversations, negotiations, the issues would be resolved. All right. So thereby we constituted what is called the Trade Policy Forum, which is the name of the trade dialogue. The Trade Policy Forum was constituted at the level of the commerce ministers, which continues to have whole dialogue, right? But ultimately, the issue was not resolved in a year, and US in the same time is taking actions like GSP withdrawal. So India imposed tariffs on the US products, agricultural products mainly, right? And then we said that we understand that on some issues, India and US would remain to have differences, right? On some issues, we need to create a better understanding, all right? And on some issues, it is a matter of US policy. For example, it's immigration policy, which has an effect on H and L category visas, right? So we need to engage. So thereby we said that India's approach towards this issue has been, or response, Mohan Sharma said that we only talked about one response, that is creation of Trade Policy Forum. That is because that is the major response that we have. We created a Trade Policy Forum. So that is something that defines India's approach, which is we want to resolve these issues by dialogue, right? So either that dialogue leading to a major agreement like FTA, that would be a future goal, or that dialogue leading to some sort of a package agreement which addresses the current issues. But the first choice is dialogue, Trade Policy Forum, for resolving these kinds of differences with an expectation of an agreement. And then we also said that there are certain other issues that comes to mind when we look at India's stand, India's position. So we say that the trade issues between India and US should be seen strategically as part of the larger strategic relations rather than transactionally. All right. It also means that, for example, India and United States can look at their trade issues to include the idea that now trade or economic engagements have grown in many ways. For example, defense trade has increased, which was not there earlier. So it has an economic component. For example, petroleum trade has increased. It was not there earlier. So that is an economic component. And for example, Indian students moving to US add or contribute to US economy. So that's basically how generally we look at the issue. And the steps taken by India is either formulation of the Trade Policy Forum or retaliatory tariffs on US goods, 28 goods that we had identified, or the idea that India is free to take its issue with the United States to WTO, trade issues. That's why WTO is there, right? So in a combination, we have talked about India's position as well as response, right? So whether you look at it 1 or 2 or 3, that is not the point. The idea is that you understand that there is a need for diverse response, right? And then we had talked about investment figures also. Indian companies investing in US and generating more than 100,000 jobs, right? So that is also part of looking at this trade relation. That is India's answer, by the way, to the United States. If we talk to them, we will point out कि trade को और economic engagements को ऐसे भी देख सकते हैं, right? And then of course India is willing to have its own tariff restructuring, tariff reforms, but at its own pace, not at the pace that the US desires. So these things would continue. These are continuing issues. What is transactional approach adopted by Trump administration? Transactional approach adopted by Trump, anyone? Anyone? Rather than only fixating at the words, anyone did you focus on the examples also? So what can be the example of transactional approach? First of all, transactional approach would mean short term, taking a short term view, all right, or very narrow view of the issue. So for example, focusing on issues like India being a high tariff country, or focusing on issues like US has a trade deficit, not focusing on the fact that trade has grown for both. All right, that is one, taking a very narrow position. And then taking steps. What kind of steps? GSP withdrawal, all right, or reclassification of India out of the developing country list. So these are transactional steps, all right. These are transactional steps. All right. Now, we had moved in the direction of another area of relation, that is the area of defense and security cooperation. So if there is a question on economy, if there is a question on defense, if there is a question on overall relations, you can always start by the simple understanding that India and US have a comprehensive strategic global partnership. And then, for example, if there is a question on economy, economic engagements are a key pillar or key drivers of this relation. Or if it is on defense, you can, the next line can be that defense cooperation has emerged as an important pillar, as a strong pillar of this relationship. So when we see this, first of all, we understand that there is a context in which this is developing. What is the context? First of all, the context always is those common points that we have talked about. One, this is developing largely in the context of commonality of values. All right, so we can say that this is a cooperation with a like-minded country with whom we may have much in common. All right, and then it is happening in the context of commonality of interests or convergence emerging, including, for example, in the larger geostrategic domain, Indo-Pacific, or including on specific questions like China or China's unilateral assertion, all right, or expansion of Chinese influence. And then we also remember that it also has a commercial aspect. So thereby yesterday what we had said was that there is complementarity also. What kind of complementarity? India being among the largest importers in the world of defense equipments, and US being the largest exporter of defense equipments in the world. So of course there is a commercial aspect also. We should never forget that anything cannot be based on one single point, कि China को counter करने के लिए है बस. All right, then the relationship is not going to last much. But we understand that the relations are based on multiple factors. So the simple formula for that is that any relationship either is based on commonality of values and interests, all right, or cultural civilizational linkages plus interests. All right, so that is something that we should look at. And of course any relationship would also have commercial aspect, more so in the case of United States, where we have mentioned that arguments regarding what benefit there is for us to spend taxpayers' dollars on another country. All right, for example, by providing them technology which may not be available to them anywhere else, or equipments which may not be available to them anywhere else. ये लोग पूछते हैं यूएस की पॉलिटिक्स में, ऐसे डिबेट होती है वहाँ पे. और दूसरा, that the private sector in US, the way US has developed, so right, so US independence itself is based on certain particular ideas. All right, for example, the slogans like no taxation without representation. So the idea of market economy is developed to a much larger logical extent in United States. That's why United States is what it is. So when we are dealing with United States, the private sector also plays an important role, is also an important partner. Thereby we see that largely the relations are driven by the government. So we said that India and US signed as part of their strategic partnership or engaging with each other strategically agreements intending to advance defense cooperation. So for example, defense cooperation framework agreement was signed in the year 2005. So we start with broad agreements that we want to, that simply convey that India and US want to engage, and defining what kinds of engagements, right? So framework cooperation agreement or defense cooperation framework agreement, and then we move in the direction of giving it further shape, right? So you will recall that further shape either can be seen in terms of the earlier agreements like GSOMIA, which is General Security of Military Information Agreement, all right, General Security of Military Information Agreement, all right, or we see it in terms of reaching a logical stage with US intending to designate India as a major defense partner, and that happened in 2016. So major defense partner status to India as the logical culmination of what started in 2005, because in this period they had further developed dialogue, engagement, visits, and now we are moving towards a stable framework for defense cooperation. All right, why? Because when you are dealing with the US, you are dealing with a complex democratic system. So there has to be a legal status. Why preferential defense trade with you? Why preferential defense agreements with you? So the category that has been identified for India is major defense partner, and this generally is embedded in US legislation like NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. All right, National Defense Authorization Act, जैसे हमारा डिफेंस बजट होता है वैसे उनका भी ये डिफेंस बजट है. डिफरेंस यही है कि हमारा अराउंड 70 बिलियन का है, उनका मोर देन 700 बिलियन का है. सो बिकॉज मनी इज बीइंग authorized by the Congress, so if some money it goes towards developing relations with India, justification has to be there. Why? So thereby the category called major defense partner. समझ में आ गई आपको बात? Right. So being major defense partner requires certain agreements creating the larger framework. What is this? This is simply a framework for deepening the cooperation. What framework? A larger status of India as a major defense partner, which is based on signing of agreements which create legal obligations, legal framework. So one, we signed LEMOA, Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement in 2016. LEMOA, Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement 2016. So what does it do? So generally US with its allies, yesterday we had mentioned, either US has allies like NATO allies or non-NATO, major non-NATO allies, or US has other form of alliances, for example the 5I system. So these are traditional categories of partners for US. So then when we see US relations, we generally see closer cooperation means these kinds of agreements. For example, logistics support agreement. Right? Logistics support agreement is generally signed by the US with its allies. That means, for example, sharing of logistics का क्या मतलब हुआ? Logistics का simple example क्या हुआ? Any example of logistics? Huh? For example, ports is an example of logistics. All right? Logistics का मतलब यही हुआ, ports जैसी चीजें. तो जब हम यहाँ पे कहते हैं logistics support agreement, it means that both sides would extend support in logistics. It means that both sides would facilitate access to each other's logistics, right, to their partner. That is what it means, right? So this can mean a lot of things. For example, US has a military presence on the soil of Australia. All right, they have certain common bases. US has a military presence on the soil of Japan, Okinawa. All right, US has a presence in South Korea. US has a presence in Bahrain. All right, in terms of basing its naval fleet there. So these kinds of arrangements may mean that there can be extensive cooperation in logistics sharing. जैसे मतलब अगर कहीं war launch करना है तो आप उस टेरिटरी से कर सकते हैं. So that can mean logistics sharing. That can be the meaning of logistics sharing agreement. But India is not willing to have that kind of cooperation. And that's why India negotiated an agreement which is a modified version of the LSA, and it is called Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement. Right? So it basically facilitates access to designated facilities. Right? Access to each other's designated facilities for designated purposes. What is it that LEMOA does? It facilitates access to designated facilities. All right? Each other's designated facilities. Meaning, designated, meaning some. Those which are identified to be shared for designated purposes. meaning only for few purposes which are already identified. समझ गए आप? So what is it that LEMUA does? Anyone? It facilitates access to each other's designated facilities for designated purposes, meaning predefined purposes. So thereby you will see here designated facilities are to be shared in cases like exercise, when there is a bilateral exercise, or when there are activities like port call, when a ship is visiting the other country on a friendly visit, or when these countries are conducting what is called HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So US can't ask India that I want to launch a war on China, so can I do it from your logistics? No, not this kind of cooperation. That happens between allies, right? This is a partnership. And then what kind of, so designated purposes, refueling, all right, rest, recreation, all right, or repair. These kinds of support can be provided. So Indian ships, if they are passing through Indian Ocean region, and if they, for example, require a fuel, all right, they can stop over on Indian ports, designated ports, right? So for example, a US ship flying from Pacific landed in 2021 in Andaman Nicobar and refueled and flew back. So this happens for specific purposes, and this is a way of creating familiarity, interoperability. So we have created a framework. अब हर बार exercise करेंगे तो उसकी accounting exercise नहीं करनी पड़ेगी कि किसका खर्चा, right? We have a framework, LEMUA. Where would it be covered? Where would the expenses be covered? LEMUA, under the LEMUA arrangement. Then we signed something called COMCASA, Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, 2018. All right, in 2018, India and US signed COMCASA, Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, which means what? So US signs another form of agreement which is generally referred to as SISMOA. All right. So this kind of agreement ensures cooperation in communications links, communications equipments, all right, sharing of sensitive communication technology, sharing of sensitive communications equipments, sharing of sensitive communication links. So that is what this agreement is all about, right? Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, meaning when we are operating together, working together, we'll have to share common communications platform. All right. Sometimes when India, let's say, is buying a defense equipment from United States, it may like to add certain different technologies, है ना? एक तो हो गया आपने बेयर प्लेन खरीद लिया, फिर आपने चुना कि उसमें एवियोनिक्स किस तरह का होगा, राडार्स कौन से होंगे, all right, communication system क्या होगा. So this also facilitates sharing of sensitive communications equipment. All right. So basically, as name suggests, it creates a framework for sharing of sensitive communications technology and equipments. All right. That is what this agreement does. So it creates further basis of closer cooperation, either when we are exchanging communications technology, either when we are using US based communication links. So it helps in India and US in engaging each other in this area, communications technology, all right, or practically it may also mean that India and other countries which are using US communication systems or US communications technology or US data link for their military purposes, their cooperation also improves. All right. So two basic benefits: one, closer cooperation with United States in this area, and also possibly, practically, closer cooperation with other countries which use similar systems or US based data links for military purposes. And then we signed the next agreement, which is called the BECA, Basic Exchange Cooperation Agreement. All right, 2020-21, right? So BECA, Basic Exchange Cooperation Agreement. So it simply enables cooperation in geospatial technology, sharing of the results of geospatial assets like satellites, right? So information on terrain or mapping or location, these all can be mapped by the help of the satellite links. And US runs the largest constellation of satellites for both civilian communications purposes as well as for military communications and surveillance purposes. So this enables us cooperation in these kinds of links, right? Maps, right? Or guided precision technology for weapons like missiles, rockets. All these benefit from this technology cooperation, geospatial technology cooperation under BECA, right? Either exchange of maps based on US own satellites or in terms of real-time information about terrain, about location, about movement of troops, right? And thereby also if we are aiming at precision in our weapon systems such as missiles, all right? So in that context also this can be helpful. So these three together are called the foundational, these three together are called the foundational agreements, all right? They are the foundational agreements, meaning they are creating a foundation for what? For closer defense cooperation, right? So what are foundational agreements? These are agreements signed by US with its closest allies and partners to deepen defense cooperation, right? So foundational agreements are agreements signed by US with its closest allies and partners to deepen defense cooperation. So what do they do? First of all, they create a legal framework, all right? So foundational agreements are creating a legal framework for cooperation, legal framework for cooperation, facilitating what? One, either exchange of information. What kind of framework? For exchange of information, all right? What other activities are facilitated? So then exchange of equipments. This means, in other words, it smoothens the defense trade because it is happening under an established framework. So defense trade, it facilitates ease of defense trade, and it facilitates interoperability between the two sides, all right? That's what these agreements do. Foundational agreements are agreements signed by US with its close partners and allies to deepen defense cooperation. These agreements create a legal framework for facilitation of exchange of information as well as exchange of equipments, thereby facilitating defense trade, smoothing the defense trade, and thereby also, since common systems would be used by both sides, thereby also facilitating interoperability between the two sides, between the defense systems of two sides, between the defense establishment of two sides, and thereby defense forces of the two sides. So that's what these agreements do. So now we have a systematic basis of moving forward, and this is something that would be required. And then sometimes we see some steps are taken to broaden the scope of cooperation. So this is government to government agreement. This is, we are talking about when governments are engaging, right? So largest category of cooperation, broadest category of cooperation. And then Industrial Security Annex was added to what is called the GSOMIA. All right, Industrial Security Annex was added to GSOMIA, General Security of Military Information Agreement. So that is first, that agreement facilitated a framework for exchange of sensitive information between the governments that can include information like technology and design. Industrial Security Annex facilitated expanded GSOMIA to allow cooperation between defense industries of both sides. All right, so Industrial Security Annex 2020 added cooperation between defense industries of both sides within the scope of larger defense cooperation. All right, Industrial Security Annex. And then as I had said, that we also understand that there are certain other steps. For example, US including India into a list called Strategic Trade Authorization 1. All right, so India's status has been upgraded to be included in STA 1 category, STA 1, and that happened in 2018. And this basically is a status which allows India to not go through applying for different licenses for importing defense equipments. All right, so that is basically what this does, meaning it is a select group of countries in one list which don't have to apply for separate licenses. What kind of licenses? So basically, if you are buying from the US, even a commercial buy from the US of weapons would go through certain approval. For example, कोई भी देश approval का उसका एक process होगा. So for example, there is the commerce list, which is generally cleared by the Department of Commerce in the United States. And then there is a list of equipments for defense technology cleared by the Department of State, right? So Department of State or Department of Commerce, these would be two agencies from which generally clearance would be required, separate clearance. For what? For either military technology or dual use technology. All right, if you are importing technology, it can be dual use technology. For example, communications technology, you cannot differentiate in terms of use as military, for military purposes or for civilian purposes, right? So dual use technology and military technology, military goods. If we are buying from US, we have to apply for 2 licenses. So when you are in this status, which is the Strategic Trade Authorization 1, it basically grants you a license exempt status for importing defense equipments, meaning we won't have to apply or get clearance from, or these sales would not have to get clearance from Department of State and Department of Commerce separately, right? Why? Because now US is trading with a country which has a designated status, STA1, which is a license exempt status, right? So that is something that will happen. So what is the value of this STA1? Again, the same thing. One, it signals the deepening of strategic trust between India and US, right? That US is willing to provide India this kind of a status. So it signals the willingness to develop strategic trust, or the development of strategic trust in India-US relations. Second, it is recognition of India's responsible track record, that India is a responsible country, so you can export to it. All right. So it is an acknowledgement of India's responsible track record in terms of weapons equipments. Thirdly, it is a step which is very important for US companies, right? So it smoothens the defense commerce, all right, or commercial aspects of defense cooperation. For example, US companies have argued that because of these difficulties of separate licenses, for example, the US companies lost out on opportunities worth 11 billion US dollars in Indian market. है ना? So they are basically asking their government to create an ease for defense sales, right? And much lies in the hands of these defense companies of the United States. They are some of the biggest lobbyists in the United States, right? So this has a commercial element also, that it would enable US companies to sell equipment to India, all right, provide them better market opportunity, right? So through these steps, India and US are moving towards further deepening of their defense ties. And this involves, apart from agreements, foundational agreements, this also involves partnership where some of India's ambitions are also supported. So for example, US would always tell you that we will help India in becoming a major power. We will enable India to become a major power. अब ये तो खैर कहने की बात है, कोई आपको मेजर पावर बनाता नहीं है, आपको खुद से बनना होगा. But still, that is something that they are saying. So we understand that it has various perspectives. So one thing is that India always has intended to indigenize defense manufacturing, including the possibility of technology transfer. Technology transfer कोई नहीं करेगा आपको. It's very difficult. But you can develop technologies together by taking advantage of, let's say, research capabilities of US institutions, and of course research capabilities of Indian institutions like the DRDO, right? So DTTI started in 2012 with the purpose of what? With the purpose of again providing strategic character to defense cooperation, right? That this is not a single issue relationship based on single priorities, it is a broader relationships, right? So basically it started with the aim of providing strategic character to defense cooperation, right? And it involves, if agar US se पूछो, so US intends to assist India in developing defense technologies. That defense technology, that is what US would say, that we intend to help India in expanding its capabilities by enabling it to develop defense technology, right? So thereby the aim is to move in the direction of co-design and co-production, and thereby various working groups under DTTI identify various projects to be implemented through, for example, project assistance channel. So when we say project assistance, it means cooperation between governments, right? DOD, Department of Defense in US, and Ministry of Defense in India, all right? So some cooperation would be between government institutions. For example, India has its own institutions like DRDO, all right? Or another aim is also identifying projects which can be implemented through industry cooperation, meaning governments promoting engagement between the private sector. So thereby yesterday we had noted that, for example, projects like unmanned aerial vehicle most recently have been identified as project areas to be developed together, right? And we will also see then one example of India-US defense relations going forward as a result of initiatives like ISA, Industrial Security Annex, and also DTTI is, for example, joint ventures between US entities and Indian entities. For example, a joint venture between Tata and Lockheed Martin, all right? A joint venture between Tata and Lockheed Martin, which basically has a facility at Hyderabad, which constructs fuselage for US made helicopters, right? So some part of this cooperation also is focusing on joint venture between the private sector of India and private sector in the यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स. एंड जनरली यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स में कोई पब्लिक सेक्टर नहीं है डिफेंस मैन्युफैक्चरिंग में. टेक्नोलॉजी कंट्रोल अप्रूवल रेगुलेशन दिस इज इन द हैंड ऑफ गवर्नमेंट. ऑलराइट, सो देयर इज क्लोज कोऑपरेशन बिटवीन the private sector and the government in the US itself. Most of their military procurement, military functions are actually outsourced, right? Outsourcing होती है उनके काम की. डिफेंस डिपार्टमेंट ने एक प्रोजेक्ट निकाला कि फ्यूचर का एक फाइटर एयरक्राफ्ट डेवलप करना है, उसका कॉन्ट्रैक्ट गया फॉर एग्जांपल लॉकहीड मार्टिन को या बोइंग को, तो फिर वो बनाएंगे F-16, F-35, और वो जब बेचना होगा तो वो कंपनी अपने आप नहीं बेच पाएगी. वो तभी बेच पाएगी जब गवर्नमेंट उसको किसी को बेचना चाहती है. मेजर उनका प्रोक्योरर क्योंकि यूएस आर्मी ही रहेगी, यूएस मिलिट्री ही रहेगी. सो दे आर मैन्युफैक्चरिंग फॉर यूएस मिलिट्री. दिस इज कॉल्ड डिफेंस मिलिट्री इंडस्ट्रियल कॉम्प्लेक्स. ऑलराइट, अ पार्टनरशिप बिटवीन गवर्नमेंट एंड द प्राइवेट सेक्टर फॉर डेवलपिंग डिफेंस मैन्युफैक्चरिंग कैपेबिलिटीज. मिलिट्री इंडस्ट्रियल कॉम्प्लेक्स, राइट? सो दैट इज हाउ वी डील विद द यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स, राइट? सो F-16, F-35 ये बनाएगा प्राइवेट सेक्टर, बट इट वुड बी पार्ट ऑफ लार्जर प्रोजेक्ट ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट. ऑलराइट, लार्जर प्रोक्योरमेंट वुड बी फॉर द यूएस एयरफोर्स, यूएस मिलिट्री, but then that private sector is also free to sell it to the rest of the world, but for selling it to the rest of the world it needs the approval of the US government, right? ऐसे basically ये इसलिए जरूरी. तो private sector are also cooperating, right? So that's why I said there is a lot of private sector movement in terms of defense manufacturing. जिनको भी शेयर मार्केट में इंटरेस्ट है उनको शेयर खरीदना चाहिए फॉर एग्जाम्पल, ऑलराइट, ऑफ डिफेंस कंपनीज, बिकॉज दैट इज गोइंग टू बी a $120 billion opportunity within a decade. जिनको पता है वो कर रहे हैं, ऑल राइट. जिनके पास पैसा है वो कंपनी खोल रहे हैं, बिकॉज दे अंडरस्टैंड द इंटरसेक्शन ऑफ इकोनॉमिक इंटरेस्ट एज वेल एज रिलेशंस बिटवीन टू गवर्नमेंट. दो देशों के रिलेशन से क्या हो सकता है, राइट? नाउ वी अंडरस्टैंड दिस एंड देन वी लुक एट सम अदर एग्जाम्पल्स. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, इंडिया एंड यूएस अपार्ट फ्रॉम दिस कोऑपरेशन have been increasing the number of exercises, which started with Malabar exercise, right, starting in 1992-93, right, and then it now has included exercises like Yudh Abhyas. We have another exercise called, this is a tri-services exercise called Tiger Triumph. We have a regular Air Force exercise bilateral which is called COPE India exercise, right? Multiple exercises, right? Multiple exercises, or multilateral exercises like Milan. Milan is India's multilateral naval exercise since 1998. And US participates in it. India participates in US hosted multilateral exercise called RIMPAC, Rim of the Pacific exercise, right? So another aspect of India-US defense cooperation deepening within their larger strategic cooperation is the number of exercises which both sides engage in, from bilateral exercises to multilateral exercises. There is another exercise called Vajra Prahar, the counter-terrorism exercise, Vajra Prahar. So thereby, as I've been repeating this, India today exercises more with US as compared with any other country. So रशिया के साथ डिफेंस रिलेशन है, इंपॉर्टेंट है, उसके अपने एस्पेक्ट्स हैं. यूएस के साथ भी डिफेंस रिलेशन है, उसके अपने एस्पेक्ट्स हैं. सो इट इज first of all awareness about different areas of engagement, and then you can also include cooperation in counter-terrorism. So they have constituted dialogues on counter-terrorism, all right, counter-terrorism joint working group. Then they have internal security dialogue, which in US parlance is called Homeland Security. So Homeland Security Dialogue as part of Homeland Security Working Group, or they keep on increasing. For example, when Donald Trump visited India, they started counter narcotics dialogue, in 2020. All right, and now they have constituted most recently defense space dialogue, and 2021, 22, and then now they have started a defense cyber dialogue. All right, cyber security dialogue. So India and US have been constituting a lot of dialogues, and only through dialogue का purpose क्या होता है? First you start talking, then only you reach towards major agreements, है ना, या major initiatives. यहीं से वो initiatives निकल के आते हैं, exercises or agreements, right? So we can say that this is the third aspect of their relationship, which is increasing number of dialogue in the area of security, ranging from counter-terrorism working group dialogue or homeland security dialogue, which started in the last decade, or in most recent times counter-narcotics dialogue, and most recent ones are defense space dialogue and defense cyber dialogue, right? So increasing number of dialogues, right? And as I said, different sources say that as a result, what has happened? Resultantly, what has also happened? Defense procurement. This was not a traditional case, has reached to 20 billion US dollars in terms of what we have bought or what we have ordered, yet not received, but ordered from the United States. So different sources would say 13 billion US dollars to 20 billion US dollars. So they are referring to either products already bought or products which have been ordered from the United States. So this is how India-US defense cooperation looks like, right? Spread across different areas with different examples, you are only proving one thing, that defense has emerged as an important pillar of India-US strategic partnership. All right, and thereby, since these two sides are new in terms of the experience of this kind of cooperation, it has moved through step by step evolutions, moved through step by step development. समझ में आ गई आपको बात? Any questions by anyone? For example, yesterday people were saying कि notes जो है हमारे क्या बन गए, rough copy बन गई. तो कभी कभी आइडिया ये भी है कि अब ये आखिरी रिलेशन हम बात कर रहे हैं, तो हमने एक ही तरह से हर रिलेशनशिप में बात कर ली है. यूएस के अंदर आइडिया है कि आपको सबसे ज्यादा एग्जाम्पल दिया जाए. सो इफ यू अंडरस्टैंड द डिफरेंस बिटवीन व्हाट इज एग्जाम्पल एंड व्हाट इज बेसिकली मेजर मोटा मोटा फ्रेमवर्क, यू विल फाइंड इट ईजियर टू मेक नोट्स. अगर आप कोशिश करेंगे कि ये मेरी तरह कॉपी करें, भाई ये जरूरी नहीं कि आप मेरी तरह लिखें, अपनी तरह लिखें, बट focus that I am saying that different kinds of examples are there. First we talked about how it started, then we talked about with the agreements, and then we looked at various examples, right? So कुछ examples हैं और कुछ major idea है, right? और दूसरा ये है कि अपने ही रफ को अगर आपने फेयर कर लिया, तो यही तो बचपन में करते थे ना, बचपन में होमवर्क कर लेते थे. एक होता था CW कॉपी, एक होती थी HW कॉपी, क्लास वर्क एंड होमवर्क कॉपीज. क्लास वर्क हमेशा रफ होता था, बिकॉज आप हमेशा टीचर को फॉलो नहीं कर पाते थे, कुछ चीज़ें कॉपी करते थे, कुछ नहीं करते थे. होमवर्क के लिए आपके पास टाइम होता था. सो यूपीएससी के प्रिपरेशन में भी क्लास वर्क और होमवर्क की आदत डाल लीजिए, राइट? सो ये तो किसी ने नहीं कहा ना कि 3 घंटे क्लास में पढ़ने के बाद अगले पढ़ने की जरूरत ना पड़े, क्योंकि एग्जाम का नेचर नहीं है. दिस इज नॉट द नेचर ऑफ द एग्जामिनेशन. 3 घंटे क्लास में पढ़ने के बाद उसको लगातार 1 साल पढ़ना पड़ेगा. सो दैट इज द टास्क ऑफ टाइम मैनेजमेंट. ऐसा कोई भी सब्जेक्ट नहीं और ऐसा कुछ भी नहीं होगा जो एक बार पढ़ लिया और फिर उसके बाद जिंदगी में कभी पढ़ने की जरूरत नहीं है. ऑलराइट, दिस इज व्हाट इज कॉल्ड प्रोग्रेसिव रिवीजन, राइट? सो इफ यू हैव एनी क्वेश्चंस, प्लीज फील फ्री टू सेंड देम. आता है भाई, मैंने कब कहा लेमोआ नहीं आता है? क्या मैंने कहा कि लेमोआ नहीं आता है फाउंडेशनल एग्रीमेंट में? ऐसा मैंने कहा आपसे? लेमोआ, कॉमकासा और बेका, कौन दोनों सिमिलर हैं? सिस्मोआ एग्रीमेंट का अदरवाइज नाम है. जैसे लेमोआ को LSA कहता है यूएस अपने अलाइज के साथ. हमारे साथ जब जो साइन हुआ उसको हमने नाम दिया लेमोआ, लॉजिस्टिक्स एक्सचेंज मेमोरेंडम ऑफ एग्रीमेंट। वैसे ही सिस्मोआ, ऑल राइट, एग्रीमेंट हो जो यूएस साइन करता है। हमारे साथ जो एग्रीमेंट साइन किया उसका नाम है कॉमकासा, ऑल राइट। हाँ, तो ये मतलब है इसका, राइट। तो सिमिलर नहीं है, मतलब आपने ये एरो वेरो सब ड्रॉ कर लिया मेरे साथ। तीन ही एग्रीमेंट है, मैंने कल आपको बताया था ना, जब कल मोटा मोटा जब मैंने लिखाया था तो वहां पे आपको मैंने बता दिया था, राइट। यहाँ पे साइड में मैं आपको बता रहा हूँ कि ऐसा एग्रीमेंट होता है, इसको हमने ऐसे करके साइन किया। ये आइडिया बहुत ही सिंपल है कि इंडिया निगोशिएट करेगा कि उसको क्या पसंद है क्या पसंद नहीं है, राइट। एंड यूएस वुड आल्सो हैव टू लर्न कि इंडिया के साथ कैसे डील करना है, राइट, बिकॉज दिस इज अ रिलेटिवली न्यूअर पार्टनर, राइट। होमलैंड सिक्योरिटी डायलॉग विद यूएसए, नेशनल सिक्योरिटी डायलॉग विद फ्रांस हैव सेम पर्पसेस। इसका कोई कंपैरेटिव वो होता नहीं है शरणवीर, राइट। होमलैंड सिक्योरिटी इज फॉर इंटरनल सिक्योरिटी, नेशनल सिक्योरिटी डायलॉग इज फॉर रेंज ऑफ सिक्योरिटी इश्यूज, ऑल राइट। नेशनल सिक्योरिटी का मतलब हो गया ब्रॉडर range of security issues we are discussing, but that is at the level of national security advisors there, right। और यहाँ होमलैंड सिक्योरिटी डायलॉग का मतलब हुआ हम इंटरनल सिक्योरिटी के इश्यूज डिस्कस कर रहे हैं, राइट। होमलैंड सिक्योरिटी जैसे होम मिनिस्ट्री, जैसे पुलिस, ऑल राइट, इस तरह का कोऑपरेशन, राइट। एनीथिंग एल्स? रिक्रिएशन, खेल कूद, रुक के आराम करेंगे, आराम करने के साथ स्विमिंग पूल में आप तैरेंगे भी, कहने का बस तरीका है। रिफ्यूलिंग, रिक्रिएशन, ऑल राइट, रेस्ट, रिक्यूपरेशन, रिक्रिएशनल एक्टिविटीज कहते हैं ना, रिक्रिएशनल एक्टिविटीज, तो मनोरंजन से हमने किसी को नहीं रोका है, राइट। रेस्ट, रिफ्यूलिंग, रिक्रिएशन, रिफर्बिशमेंट, रिपेयर, वेयर हाउसिंग, कुछ लोग कह रहे हैं वेयर हाउसिंग भी आप कर ले, बट डिपेंडिंग ऑन वेयर हाउसिंग, जैसे अब ये नहीं होगा, एक प्रपोजल था कि कॉमनली कमांड्स में जॉइंटली ऑफिसर्स अपॉइंट किए जाएं, ऐसा नहीं होगा। इंडिया वुड नॉट बी कंफर्टेबल विथ यूएस अपॉइंटिंग एन ऑफिसर टू इट्स कमांड्स एंड इंडिया अपॉइंटिंग इट्स ऑफिसर्स टू यूएस कमांड्स, राइट। सो दैट इज मच क्लोजर फॉर्म ऑफ कोऑपरेशन, दैट वुड नॉट हैपन, राइट। बट सिंपल आइडिया, व्हाट इज जिसोमिया? जिसोमिया इज जनरल सिक्योरिटी ऑफ मिलिट्री इंफॉर्मेशन एग्रीमेंट, ऑल राइट, ऑल कैपिटल्स, General Security of Military Information Agreement. Can developments like India getting direct access to Pentagon be also part of defense partnership? India getting direct access का क्या मतलब है? Communication channels are expedited, right? For example, Dr. Jaishankar visited the Pentagon, or Indian officials now are those who are visiting Pentagon. So this is also part of, as you are saying, defense partnership, but this is a very small example. This is a very small example of what is happening between India and United States. So of course, India getting, if you are saying India getting access to Pentagon, right? That is also an example, right? Let's move forward then to include other areas of India-US cooperation as part of their strategic partnership. What are other areas? So we will club together technology, energy, and environment, all right, as part of, remember the name, comprehensive global strategic partnership, right? So we see that cooperation in the area of technology, cooperation in the area of energy, and cooperation in the area of environment, all right, all are part of either India-US dialogue or India-US cooperation. यहीं पे आप एक और जोड़ लें, development, all right. So for example, let's start with this. So India and US have the climate cooperation agenda of 2030. Within that they are cooperating. So they have partnership in the area of, apart from other things, clean energy. For example, US has an initiative called South Asia Energy Initiative, all right, South Asia Energy Initiative. So these are larger initiatives of US and they are relevant to this kind of cooperation. either climate cooperation agenda 2030 or clean energy dialogue between India and US. And then there is partnership between what is called the Development Partnership Administration of India, right? India, under the Ministry of External Affairs, has something called Development Partnership Administration, which basically manages in different parts India's line of credits or development projects that we have so far talked about. All right? And between US aid, all right, US aid, Development Partnership Administration of India, or US aid, all right, US Agency for International Development, or US aid in other incarnation, which is Development Finance Corporation of United States, all right, Development Finance Corporation of United States. So this is largely development cooperation, but we can see, for example, there is a company of US called First Solar, all right, First Solar. So First Solar is establishing manufacturing facility in India, manufacturing facility for photovoltaic cells. So here the DFC would be financing it to the tune of 500 million US dollars, all right. So that is the kind of cooperation that we can see, either targets larger vision for cooperation in terms of climate, or within that dialogue in specific areas. For example, clean energy. These days we talk about green energy transition, moving away from fossil fuels to renewables, all right. And then we have cooperation, for example, US has the initiative called South Asia Energy Initiative, and then within that you have some examples of how this actualizes in terms of specific projects. This is a US company called First Solar, which is establishing manufacturing facility in India, and this manufacturing facility would be facilitated by financing from Development Finance Corporation of United States. समझ में आ गया आपको बात? तो इस तरह के बहुत सारे कोऑपरेशन है इंडिया और यूएस के बीच में. एनर्जी का अगर स्पेसिफिक एग्जांपल देख लें तो 2017-18 India started procuring both petroleum in the sense of oil and also LNG from the US. By 2019, this trade has increased to around 9 billion US dollars. All right, petroleum trade between India and US, from being non-existent, it increased by 2019 to 9 billion US dollars. So we are procuring now from the United States. United States is one of our suppliers. Till 2014, US had put a ban on exports of its petroleum, right? And also, US was slow in developing its own petroleum reserves. तो अपना रिजर्व बचा के पहले मिडिल ईस्ट से सस्ता ऑयल लेके यूएस ने काम चलाया. After 2014, Obama lifted the ban on petroleum exports. So after that, we see that now India buys from the United States. And not only this, both Reliance and GAIL have investments from India in areas like shale gas assets or LNG terminals, जहाँ पे the gas is liquefied for export. All right. So इस तरह के infrastructure में US company, Indian companies invest कर रही हैं. Right. Reliance, GAIL, all of them have invested in shale gas assets or LNG terminals like infrastructure in the United States. Right. So this is another cooperation that you will see which has been added in this रिलेशन. इसलिए यूएस से डरने का तो कोई सवाल ही नहीं उठता. जब तक आपकी इकोनॉमी बढ़िया कर रही है, आपका मार्केट अच्छा रहेगा, यूएस के साथ आपके संबंध अच्छे बने रह सकते हैं. रहेंगे नहीं, रह सकते हैं. सो इट डिपेंड्स ऑन व्हाट वी डू डोमेस्टिकली, इकोनॉमिकली, राइट. एंड देन इन टर्म्स ऑफ द टेक्नोलॉजी कोऑपरेशन, We have multiple examples. For example, the civil nuclear agreement of 2008 itself facilitates much technology cooperation in the area of nuclear technology, right? Then we have examples like in space technology, we have examples like development of NISAR, which is NASA ISRO synthetic aperture radar. All right, NISAR, we are developing together. US has a gravitational observation laboratory called LIGO. India is developing INDIGO. All right, so cooperation in the development of India's own indigenous gravitational observatory, that is INDIGO. So that is another form of cooperation. NISAR is a radar system, right? NASA ISRO synthetic aperture radar. And cooperation in the area of either the moon mission, because remember our Chandrayaan and the US efforts in exploring the moon coincided, right? US also launched its own Mars mission, Mangalyaan bhi. India also launched its own Mars mission. But the contrast is that India does it at a much cheaper value. All right, so thereby the now NASA looks at India or ISRO as a partner for the future, right? Much of NASA's activities are also being outsourced, right? And ISRO has emerged as one of the competitive options when it comes to either, let's say, satellite launches. So satellite launches by ISRO are much cheaper. Similarly, our Mars mission or our lunar mission Chandrayaan were much cheaper as compared to US. US का अपना Marvin mission था. So in that context also there is cooperation, right? And ISRO has launched US satellites, right? Remember US launch of US satellites, not necessarily government satellites. Universities भी वहाँ satellites बना रही हैं, right? So that's why India is a cheaper option. Cooperation between ISRO and NASA and space establishment of India and the United States. Similarly, you will see that India's space program procures from world over. हम सारी technology खुद नहीं बनाते. So for example, there is a US contractor called Raytheon. All right, Raytheon, a large US contractor that is a supplier to India's space program. So you have various examples of technology cooperation, and that dates back to the period before 1970s also. In the before 1970s, many of the Indians worked in the nuclear sector and the space sector of United States. So we benefited from that experience. Our first satellite was built with help of United States, launched with the help of USSR, right? And then for example, the launch of initial facilities in India, for example, the rocket sounding launch pad at Thumba, all these were happening in the era of cooperation between India and US space establishment. India had launched initially a television based, जैसे आज हमारा program है Digital India. So India initially had started program for tele education, right? India had conducted an experiment of education program through television by using satellite communication, and in that also we had cooperation with the United States. So earlier there was cooperation, 1970s onwards the scientific cooperation dwindled, specifically in light of India not signing the NPT, and now we are reviving it. All right, now we are reviving it. One old example can be the establishment of IIT Mumbai or Bombay with the help of the Americans, right? Today we see this mainly in the area of civil nuclear technology, because US would remain a leading country, to space by development of the common platforms like NISAR, NASA, ISRO, synthetic aperture radar systems, or by development of common facilities like INDIGO, or by in the launch of satellites, where ISRO is emerging as a low cost option, and also companies like Raytheon providing equipments to India. All right, so these are various examples that you will see in terms of either environment development, or in the area of energy, or in the area of technology, which you can also remember as diverse sets of examples, right? And then we have the area of diaspora, right? So for example, we say that the diaspora is an important pillar of India US relations, right? An important pillar of India US relations is the diaspora, right? Now here we see that around 4.5 million Indians live and work in USA, right? And in terms of recent migration, Indians are only second to Mexico in terms of country of origin of immigrants to United States, right? Now if we see this, what we find is it's a small minority, but if you look at factors like household median income, the Indians have the highest household median income among the ethnic groups in United States. So certainly among the ethnic minorities in the United States, among the Asians in the United States, right? So highest household median income. And in some areas, for example, some estimates say that 10% of doctors in the USA are of the Indian origin, all right? 10% of their doctors. Some people would say that 25% of startups in the Silicon Valley, right, are headed by Indians, right? 25% of startups in the Silicon Valley headed by Indians, right? And then Indians are also, or India also has become a much familiar name because of Indians in the corporate leadership position. You have many names, right? Generally, what names do we take? Satya Nadella or Sundar Pichai or many others. For example, earlier Indira Nooyi of the PepsiCo, और ये तो आपको ज़्यादा पता होता होगा क्योंकि आप लोग बहुत इंटरेस्ट लेते हैं कि इंडियंस क्या कर रहे हैं बाहर. और नाम बताइए. सत्या नडेला, सुंदर पिचाई, इंदिरा नूई. और नाम ट्विटर का भी पराग अग्रवाल ऑफ द ट्विटर. और एनी अदर नेम? एनी अदर नेम? तो जो भी नाम आपके दिमाग में आता हो आप लिख लीजिए. द एग्जाम्पल ऑफ कॉर्पोरेट लीडरशिप इन द यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स. ऑल राइट, फॉर एग्जाम्पल अजय पाल बंगा फॉर अ फ्यू ईयर्स हेडेड सिटी बैंक. ऑल राइट, मास्टरकार्ड. एंड एनीथिंग एल्स? एनी अदर एग्जाम्पल्स? कोई और नया नहीं बना अभी? कोई नया बड़ा आदमी यूएस में? Others, sir, explain Indigo again. So Indigo, I won't be able to explain. Please ask the science and technology teacher. But this is the gravitational observatory that we are building in India, and US already has a LIGO in the United States. So in that, India and US scientific establishments have cooperation, or we can have cooperation, right? Starbucks CEO कौन है भाई? Starbucks का CEO मुझे पता नहीं. Starbucks का CEO कौन है? स्टारबक्स का सीईओ भी ये कह रहे हैं कि इंडियन है. अमित शर्मा कहते हैं कि इंडियन है. बहुत सारे लोग, शांतनु नारायण, बहुत सारे लोग. ऑलराइट, छोटी बड़ी बहुत सारी कंपनीज इंडियंस हेड करते हैं, कॉर्पोरेट लीडरशिप पोजीशन. नॉट ओनली दिस, in the sphere of culture, cultural sphere, all right, cultural sphere, you have various Indian names which have become households. For example, an actor called Carl Penn, right? Carl Penn in movies like, I really liked him in movies like Namesake. Namesake एक movie है जिसमें इरफान साहब ने एक्टिंग की है, तब्बू है. It's a movie in English based on the book of the same name, Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri, right? Carl Penn. Or you have many comedians like Hasan Minhaj or Rajesh Kutrapalli of Big Bang Theory, Kunal Nair, all right? Or Hollywood directors like Manoj Knight, Shyamalan. So in cultural sphere also, Indians now are recognized names. अब आपको दिखता है कि अलग अलग characters, but generally doctors ही play कर रहे होते हैं. अलग अलग characters, different characters are being played by Indians in American cinema or American sitcoms. So that also shows that visibility of Indians, familiarity of Indians in the United States society has also increased, right? So in cultural sphere. But more importantly, we see that in the political space of United States, Indians now are also emerging as important faces. For example, Kamala Harris, or for example, in earlier times, Bobby Jindal became the governor of Louisiana, or after him, Nikki Haley became a governor and then later on US permanent representative to the UN, right? Or politicians like Pramila Jayapal. Various names are there which are now adding to familiarity of India in the US and thereby also the influence of India in the US, right? So that's why we also say that diaspora is an important pillar of India-US relations, either in terms of numbers or in terms of their economic attribute. For example, they are known to be rich and qualified, right? High median income. Or 10% of doctors, less than 1% of population is giving 10% of doctors, 25% of startups, meaning corporate leadership and even entrepreneurship, right? Cultural sphere. Many Indians now are household names in the US and political sphere. So in the politics of US also, India is becoming a familiar name. ऐसा नहीं है कि ये कमला हैरिस और बॉबी जिंदल और निकी हेली और ये लोग इंडिया के फेवर में ही हमेशा बात करेंगे. ऐसा इसका मतलब ये नहीं होता. इसका मतलब ये है कि इंडियंस का रोल बढ़ रहा है. All right, they are ultimately US citizens. So first and foremost, they would do whatever is good for the United States. All right, बहुत ज़्यादा जगहों पे जैसे अभी spokesperson of the State Department is of Indian origin. All right, so Priyanka Chopra भी कह रहे हैं शरणवीर सिंह. All right, I don't know about her citizenship status, but yes, she has also acted in US cinema and US sitcoms, right? शांतनु नारायण बोला, मैंने और भी बहुत सारे लोग नाम ले रहे हैं, तो बस एग्जाम्पल हैं ये. किस चीज़ के एग्जाम्पल? डायस्पोरा इमर्जिंग एज एन इंपॉर्टेंट पिलर ऑफ इंडिया US relations. All right, so after doing this, after this familiarity, we simply bind down this relation by looking at their geostrategic convergence and thereby geostrategic engagements between India and US, which is the largest driver of or factor in shaping the relationship. So we see that in all the documents that India and US share, they talk about certain ideas. For example, free and open Indo-Pacific, right? So that's something that has become a very repeated line in their official documents. They stand for generally as well as particularly a rules-based order, right? Rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific, rules-based order in South China Sea. So these are some of the common things that will appear to be shaping the relationship, and thereby this is also shaping their interactions. What kind of interactions? So bilateral is there, but also, for example, interactions in newer form of what we can call coalition of the like-minded, the Quad dialogue, all right, or the recent I2U2 dialogue, or the dialogue at the level of G20, or engagements at G7, where India is not a member, but in recent times, India-US documents would say that interaction has expanded to G7 also, of which US is a member, and India has been participating in recent years as a special invitee. G7 is expanding its interactions. Simple. इस साल जैसे सेनेगल को बुलाया, इंडिया को बुलाया, right? So G7 is interacting with countries outside the G7. So here also we have our increasing interactions. And generally what we see is that in this interaction there would be also differences. Commonality or differences we have, for example, in major regions. For example, difference on Russia, largely Russia. So we see it plays out in the form of US policies constraining India's relations with Russia. For example, CAATSA, countering American adversaries through sanctions act, all right, CAATSA, or on the matter of Iran, all right. So again, US does not have good relations with Iran, but its steps have shaped India's choices. Withdrawal from the JCPOA, which is Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That is the agreement that Iran and P5 plus 1, P5 permanent members of the Security Council plus 1, Germany and Iran had signed for limiting Iran's nuclear program. US was part of it, but US withdrew from it, and US then reinstatement of sanctions on Iran. So इससे क्या हुआ? इससे ये हुआ, it led to stoppage of oil trade, meaning we had to stop buying oil from Iran, or it put hurdle in the further development of Chabahar port investments. All right, more importantly, it delayed India's intention of developing Chabahar Zahedan railway line. All right, so that is another difference that we have. Either US policies affecting India's choices in the case of Russia, for example, CAATSA, or even now, but in a limited sense, the Ukraine related sanctions. So the US expects that India abides by these sanctions, right? And India says, so that these are unilateral sanctions and we will not abide by them. But still, we see that these are difficult factors in the relations. Where else would be differences? So you will have differences, for example, on the issue of Pakistan. All right. So under the Trump administration, when US wanted Pakistan's help in bringing the Taliban to negotiation table, US suspended military aid to Pakistan. All right. It suspended military aid to Pakistan under Trump administration. Right. But now US has reinstated, right? US has reinstated military aid to Pakistan. All right, it has reinstated military aid to Pakistan, right? So that is another thing that we see, that there have been times where India and US have largely agreed on or about Pakistan. For example, 2008 Mumbai terrorist attacks and period after that. And most recently, US had put pressure on Pakistan, right? Or for example, US had went and killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, So we have hopes in this relationship that US and India would have common views on Pakistan, but that hope changes from time to time, right? So currently US has reinstated military aid to Pakistan. Currently US is engaging with Pakistan, all right? And related with it is US approach on Afghanistan, right? So for example, the withdrawal in 2021 was sudden and unorganized. If not sudden, then certainly unorganized, but sudden in terms of the intention of US, which was very clear to only come out of the Afghanistan. Or approach on Taliban, that is also fickle. So for 20 years you fought against Taliban, and in the 21st year you suddenly change your heart about Taliban, all right? So again here, how are we affected? Because we had started investing in Afghanistan's development with an understanding that Afghanistan's stability is primarily ensured by US presence. And we calculated that this is something that would happen, that would remain to be the case. And US wanted India to play a larger role. For example, Trump administration said that India or regional countries should play a larger role. So that their expectation was that India should be participating in security operations. Of course, we would not. So then, as part of our understanding with the US, we increase our investments in Afghanistan. But suddenly, US policy change, all right? US policy change on Taliban. That is also a difficulty for India, right? So we see that there are multiple difficulties in this relationship also, though there is also commonality, either because of specific policies of US in relation with Russia or Iran affecting India's interests, or with Pakistan long-standing support of US to Pakistan and fluctuating approach on Pakistan in recent times, or in Afghanistan, the unpredictable changes in US policies have created difficulties for India. And thereby what we see is that both enhancing commonality and addressing the issues are part of India-US engagements, right? So thereby we see that the establishment of the 2+2 dialogue in 2018 was a step to address all these strategic issues comprehensively. क्या होता है इस तरह के डायलॉग में? हम हर चीज के बारे में बात कर सकते हैं, right? Between the defense minister, external affairs minister and their US counterpart. So 2018 onwards, India and US have continuously held the 2+2 dialogue. 2018, 20, right? 21 and now 22. 4 editions of this dialogue. So that's basically the solution. What should be done? Better understanding for each other's concerns and interests needs to be developed. Where would it be developed? It would be developed through these kinds of dialogues, the 2+2 dialogue, right? So in sum, what do we say are our suggestions for this relationship and generally our suggestions for international relations? Wherever possible, what needs is there should be a focus on strengthening cooperation, all right? Strengthening cooperation wherever possible. Bilaterally we see wherever possible, strengthen cooperation, technology, defense or development, strengthening cooperation, right? Secondly, at the same time, addressing differences through dialogue, right? If there are differences, what should be done? There should be a dialogue. These suggestions are not going to change, right? Addressing differences through dialogue, right? And then our option should be also avoiding entanglements, avoiding entanglements in USA's global competitions. So what should we be careful of? That while enhancing engagement and cooperation, addressing differences through dialogue, we should avoid getting entangled in US global competitions, geopolitical competitions, because that is the side effect, that is a collateral that you have associated with the relation that we have with the US. For example, US has, one example, when we say India's defense establishment, we have Northern Command, Central Command, Western Command, Eastern Command. US commands are Northcom, Northern Command, which is North America, all right, or Southcom, Southern Command, which is South America, or CENTCOM, Central Command, which generally focuses on regions like West Asia, all right, some parts of Europe. African Command, AFRICOM. Earlier they had a Pacific Command. Now they have an Indo-Pacific Command, meaning US, the way it defines its global engagements, the way it maintains global military footprint is advantageous in some sense, but also poses the risk of entanglement in what? In for example, US's regional conflicts. All right, sometimes you have to pay the price for having a friend. All right, आपके दोस्त ने किसी और के पेड़ से आम चुराए और आप साथ में थे तो आपको भी सजा मिली. So that is what we are saying, avoid entanglements as much as possible from US competition. यहाँ पे हम US की लड़ाई लड़ने के लिए और US हमारी लड़ाई लड़ने के लिए नहीं आए. हम दोनों को अपनी अपनी लड़ाई लड़नी है. जीवन में हम सभी को अपनी लड़ाई खुद लड़नी है, लेकिन कुछ लोग कुछ चीज़ों में हमारी मदद कर सकते हैं. All right? So that is what we are saying, avoid entanglements, right? And then diversify options of engagements, which means what? Which simply means working in tune with what we call as multi-alignment. All right? इसका मतलब ये है, diversify options of engagement. India should be active at the global stage. Regionally, multilaterally, bilaterally, we have number of actors. So each of these relations gives us the ability to be flexible. All right? जैसे लोग कहते हैं कि चाइना, जैसे कल का क्वेश्चन था कोई, चाइना के साथ अगर वोट कर दिया इंडिया ने तो यूएस के साथ रिलेशन का क्या होगा. तो इसी तरह के क्वेश्चन का आंसर ये है कि आपका एक ही रिलेशन नहीं होता है, आपके कई रिलेशन होते हैं. ऑल राइट, सो इट इज नॉट promiscuity, it is safeguarding your options. All right, so basically that is what we are saying, diversifying options of engagement. Diverse options of engagement are always required. And then what we are saying is, which we have said earlier also, act as a bridge. Act as a bridge wherever possible. All right, act as a bridge wherever possible. जहां संभव हो क्या करें? दोस्ती करवाएं. Become a bridge. If possible, become a facilitator for dialogue. Right? We have used this option at many places. For example, we said there is a Russia-India-China dialogue. There can be a US-Russia-India dialogue. Right? हम प्रपोज कर सकते हैं ना, कोई माने या ना माने ये अलग बात है. Right? So wherever we have other friends and US, so we find that we add to diversity of option and we achieve the diversity of options. So we can propose newer kinds of dialogue, right? So as we had said in Russia, in the case of Russia, in the Ukraine crisis, act as a bridge, act as a peacemaker, if possible. कर सकते हैं तो. And क्यों कर सकते हैं? क्योंकि हमने अभी तक किसी के खिलाफ वोट नहीं किया है. All right? So that basically gives us a certain vantage point of neutrality. We are not too involved with Russia. We are not too involved with Ukraine or Europe when it comes to Russian crisis. देखने के नजरिए के ऊपर है, आप कैसे देखते हैं इसको. और एक तरह से ऐसे भी देख सकते हैं कि हमने ऐसा रवैया अपनाने की कोशिश की, इसी को कहते हैं डिप्लोमेटिक बैलेंसिंग टाइट रोप वॉक, है ना। बहुत ही रस्सी पे चलने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, बैलेंस बनाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं। डर ये है कि कभी ना कभी गिर जाएंगे, पर यही तो दिस इज द आर्ट ऑफ डिप्लोमेसी, कि आप उस रस्सी पे कितनी देर तक चल सकते हैं। और आइडियली फिर एम क्या होता है कि उस रस्सी पे चलते 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 एक समय ऐसा है कि देयर शुड बी स्टेबिलिटी, है ना। तो लंबे समय तक आप सॉलिड ग्राउंड पे चलना चाहते हैं, पर कभी कभी आपको यू हैव टू वॉक अ टाइट रोप वॉक, ऑल राइट, समटाइम्स दैट इज ऑल्सो required, and that's why diplomacy is there, right? So here is a break. These are major suggestions in terms of any relationship. When you are thinking, think in these terms, all right? Or then we move forward and look at the ways in which India and US can focus on global cooperation. तो उसमें हम एक एरिया लेंगे कनेक्टिविटी का, right? So here is a break. After the break we continue. वेलकम बैक आफ्टर द ब्रेक। आज सवेरे मैं इंडिया यूएस के 2+2 डायलॉग के इस साल के कुछ आउटपुट देख रहा था। कुछ तो मैंने इंक्लूड कर लिया, डिफेंस स्पेस डायलॉग ये सब। तो एक तो क्लाइमेट कोऑपरेशन एजेंडा का पूरा नाम अगर आपको लिखना है, जनरली ये नाम ठीक है, पर अगर पूरा नाम लिखना है तो इंडिया यूएस क्लाइमेट क्लीन एनर्जी, इसका नाम है इंडिया यूएस क्लाइमेट क्लीन एनर्जी कोऑपरेशन एजेंडा, ऑल राइट। दूसरा है जो डायलॉग हम यहां पे कर रहे हैं, एक डायलॉग है उसका नाम लिख लो, क्लाइमेट एक्शन एंड फाइनेंस, क्लाइमेट एक्शन एंड फाइनेंस मोबिलाइजेशन, क्लाइमेट एक्शन एंड फाइनेंस मोबिलाइजेशन डायलॉग। इसके अलावा दोनों बात कर रहे हैं एक जिसको वो कहते हैं स्ट्रैटेजिक क्लीन एनर्जी पार्टनरशिप, स्ट्रैटेजिक क्लीन एनर्जी पार्टनरशिप, ऑल राइट। सो ये क्या एग्जाम्पल है जो हमने लास्ट में कहा कि भाई enhance cooperation wherever possible. So you will find major examples of these also, right? Every year जब भी जैसे 2+2 डायलॉग हुआ उसके बाद कोई डॉक्यूमेंट आया उसमें भी यही सारी चीजें मेंशन्ड होंगी, राइट? स्ट्रैटेजिक क्लीन एनर्जी पार्टनरशिप या क्लाइमेट एक्शन एंड फाइनेंस मोबिलाइजेशन डायलॉग, या लार्जर आइडिया हमारा जो है क्लाइमेट एंड क्लीन एनर्जी कोऑपरेशन एजेंडा 2030, राइट? साउथ एशिया एनर्जी इनिशिएटिव को लिख सकते हैं साउथ एशिया रीजनल एनर्जी पार्टनरशिप, साउथ एशिया रीजनल एनर्जी पार्टनरशिप, ऑल राइट। ये यूएस का इनिशिएटिव है इन फ्रॉम विच इंडिया कैन बेनिफिट, ऑल राइट। और इसके अलावा जो हम बात कर रहे हैं जो आगे कभी आएगा वो है कोऑपरेशन इन क्रिटिकल एंड इमर्जिंग टेक्नोलॉजी, ऑल राइट। सो रेंज ऑफ डायलॉग्स हैं, रेंज ऑफ इनिशिएटिव्स हैं जो किसी न किसी स्टेज ऑफ निगोसिएशन है, डिटर्मिनेशन है, राइट। सो क्रिटिकल एंड इमर्जिंग इस एरिया में, और एग्जाम्पल अगर आपको चाहिए तो क्रिटिकल एंड इमर्जिंग टेक्नोलॉजी या सीईटी कोऑपरेशन बिटवीन इंडिया एंड यूएस इज कॉल्ड फॉर, राइट। तो ये जब मैं देख रहा था आज 2+2 डायलॉग का जो डॉक्यूमेंट, उसमें मुझे लगा कि ये एग्जाम्पल्स हैं ऑफ वेयर इंडिया एंड यूएस कैन कोऑपरेट। दीज आर द एरियाज ऑफ कोऑपरेशन जनरली विच आर फ्यूचरिस्टिक इन नेचर। डिफेंस, इकोनॉमी एंड डिप्लोमेटिक इंगेजमेंट यानी डायलॉग प्लेटफॉर्म्स मेजर इंगेजमेंट है इंडिया यूएस के, जहां पे आपको सबसे ज्यादा एस्टैब्लिश एग्जाम्पल मिल जाएंगे। डेवलपमेंट, एनर्जी, क्लीन एनर्जी, क्लाइमेट, एनवायरमेंट, ये एग्जाम्पल्स हैं जहां पे आपको फ्यूचर का कोऑपरेशन मिल जाएगा, कुछ एग्जाम्पल मिलेंगे, पार्टनरशिप, राइट। सिमिलरली, राइट, लिख लिया आपने? कुछ बचा, कुछ छूट रहा हो तो बताना। लिख लिया? क्या छूटा? कुछ छूटा? कोई बात नहीं, उसको अगर वैसे भी लिखोगे तो चलेगा, लेकिन अगर बहुत ज्यादा स्पेसिफिक होना, साउथ एशिया रीजनल एनर्जी पार्टनरशिप, लिख लिया साउथ एशिया। और कुछ छूटा? Mohammad Taslim Arif, can we make short notes on all relation after reading Vision IS material link with current affairs? Yes, that is the purpose. आप कितना भी लिखना चाहो क्लास में, अल्टीमेटली आपने 100 पेज है अगर आपके पास, तो एम होना चाहिए 15 पेज बने वो एग्जाम तक, राइट? क्योंकि बाई द टाइम यू राइट द एग्जामिनेशन मोटा मोटा ही आपको याद रहता है, और फिर आप प्रैक्टिस करते हो तो प्रैक्टिस करके घिसने से जो फैक्ट्स है वो आ जाते हैं आपके उसमें, पर आपको जो रिवाइज करना है, कैरी करना है, वो जितना छोटा हो उतना अच्छा है। ऑलराइट, तो छोटा हो जाए, तो इसलिए मैं कहता हूँ कि ब्रॉड एक फ्रेमवर्क होना चाहिए कि ये एरियाज ऑफ कोऑपरेशन है, ये डायलॉग है, ये एक कॉन्क्रीट एग्जाम्पल है, यहाँ पैसे का एग्जाम्पल है, राइट? तो हर चीज़ में कुछ 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 आपको मिलेगा, तो वो करना है। तो कैन वी मेक शॉर्ट नोट ऑफ आवर रिलेशन आफ्टर रीडिंग विजन आईएएस मटेरियल एंड लिंक विद करंट अफेयर्स? यस, दैट इज द पर्पस, दैट इज व्हाट वी शुड बी डूइंग। फॉर एग्जाम्पल, जैसे मैंने कल आपको H1L1 वीज़ा पढ़ाया, तो आज मैं जब न्यूज़ स्कैन कर रहा था, आज 14 है, 15 है, तो 14 की एक न्यूज़ थी, मतलब 15 की न्यूज़ है वो, कि यूएस ने कहा है कि हम 1 लाख H और L कैटेगरी वीज़ा जो है फैसिलिटेट करेंगे इस साल, या अभी तक कर चुके हैं। तो जब आप कोई चीज़ देख लेते हो, सुन लेते हो, सो व्हाट हैपन्स इज ऑटोमेटिकली यू विल स्टार्ट नोटिसिंग इट, अखबार में आपको वो दिखने लग जाता है, राइट? So that's why when we read newspaper, what happens is very simple thing. First, you will take a lot of time. Then once you have learned the logic of it, कि क्या क्या देखना है, तो आपका काम छोटा होता जाएगा. You will start completing articles, let's say in 5 to 10 minutes. All right? क्योंकि अधिकतर आर्टिकल में या तो पुरानी बात हो रही होगी, नंबर रिपीट हो रहा होगा, आइडिया रिपीट हो रहा होगा. रिपीटिशन जल्दी से हो जाता है. फिर अगर कुछ नया आता है तो अपने आप दिखने लगता है, राइट? सो मैंने क्लास में ये एग्जाम्पल देने की कोशिश की है कि आप ऐसा करने की कोशिश करेंगे. ऐसा नहीं है कि आप यहाँ से जो लिख के ले जाएंगे वही एग्जाम में आ जाएगा, राइट? पर जो आपको देखना है, जो आपको लिखना है, वो मैं आपको एग्जाम्पल देता रहता हूँ. तो फॉर एग्जाम्पल हमने यहाँ पे बात की कि डिफरेंसेस भी हैं, कॉमनैलिटी भी है, तो क्या करना है ब्रॉडली हमको? तो हमको स्ट्रेंथनिंग कोऑपरेशन वेयर एवर पॉसिबल. तो जो वो एग्जाम्पल्स हैं, एनर्जी, इन्वायरमेंट, क्लाइमेट, ये ऐसे एग्जाम्पल है जहाँ पे कोऑपरेशन या फिर क्रिटिकल एंड इमर्जिंग टेक्नोलॉजी, ऐसे एग्जाम्पल है जहाँ पे कोऑपरेशन पॉसिबल है, जहाँ कोऑपरेशन कर सकते हैं, जहाँ कोऑपरेशन करने की ज़रूरत है इंडिया और यूएस को, राइट? सो सिमिलरली इस जियो स्ट्रैटेजिक एंगेजमेंट से एक चीज़ निकालते हैं जो है, फॉर एग्जाम्पल लेट्स से देयर इज China as a common factor. So we know that National Security Strategy document of US, ये US का document है, National Security Strategy document. It recognizes China as a strategic competitor. All right. And thereby it can mean a lot of things. It can mean, for example, competition in the area of economic competition. All right, it can mean security and defense competition. It can mean competition for leadership, competition for influence. All right, so it can mean a lot of things, and sometimes it can also mean competition between two divergent value systems. For example, Americans would say our values and our way of life. All right, actions of Russia and China are challenging our values and our way of life. So ये अमेरिका अपने कंपटीशन के हिसाब से सोच सकता है. इकोनॉमिक कंपटीशन, वर्ल्ड्स फर्स्ट एंड सेकेंड लार्जेस्ट इकोनॉमीज. ऑल राइट, वर्ल्ड्स फर्स्ट एंड सेकेंड लार्जेस्ट इकोनॉमीज. इसमें यूएस हैज लार्जेस्ट ट्रेड विथ China. China has largest trade with US. All right, and then US has a traditional trade deficit with China, which it tried to address in the Trump administration, in the Trump era, by increasing tariffs. US increased tariffs right? So this was when China also increased tariff, this was called US China trade war. ये trade war में engage कर रहे हैं. So these are all reflections of their competition. Either US trying to address its specific concerns, for example, Trump ने मुद्दा बनाया था, President Trump ने deficit को, right? Or sometimes many US politicians would call China a currency manipulator. All right, that China's currency, its value is artificially low. All right, a currency manipulator, and thereby its exports then put it in an advantageous position. Currency value low है, US dollar मजबूत है उसके मुकाबले, US major export market है, so there is a trade advantage, right? It would also play out at, for example, WTO. So US accused bodies like WTO in being ineffective against China. In what ways? That China has been able to take advantage of WTO's rule mechanism by defining regularly itself as a developing country. For example, WTO does not have a criteria for defining a developing country. That depends on self declaration. आप खुद बोलते हैं कि मैं developing country हूँ, तो US कहता है कि ये सब जो है इसका फायदा चाइना ने उठाया है. ऑल राइट, चाइना कैसा डेवलपिंग कंट्री, जैसे उन्होंने इंडिया को रिक्लासीफाई आउट ऑफ डेवलपिंग कंट्री लिस्ट कर दिया था, वैसे ही उनका व्यू चाइना के ऊपर भी है, राइट? सो इट कैन बी सीन इन टर्म्स ऑफ द WTO. ऑल राइट, सो if US and China engage in trade war, that means they are adopting policies like escalation of tariffs. That means उनको लगता है कि इनके जो ट्रेड इश्यूज हैं वो इतने विशेष हैं कि वो WTO के बाहर तय होने चाहिए, right? So that's why we say that these kinds of actions undermine the WTO. The actions of United States or even China have undermined the WTO. WTO, which represents a global trading system, right? So these competition would play out. For example, then there is competition in the area of technology. What kind of competition? So China gradually has become proficient in terms of technology development. It can be seen in terms of either Chinese universities appearing in high in global rankings, or the output in peer-reviewed journals from China increasing, or the number of patents being issued in China. So this is again only next to the United States. China technology is also growing. Now this technology is showing up in, for example, silicon chips or semiconductors, right? Semiconductors. So that is where the competition is shaping up, right? Semiconductor silicon chip अगर आपको बनाना है, so for example, Taiwan produces more than 90% of semiconductor chips globally, all right? And technology from simple electronic machine to complex rocket systems, weapon system rely on this small piece of technology. So even though Taiwan produces 90% of it, its supply chain is very, very limited, all right? The specific lenses which are used in the semiconductor foundries are produced largely in Germany, and the larger assembly line machines which are used to manufacture semiconductors are manufactured by companies of Netherlands. All right, बहुत ही limited supply chain है इसका. So meaning China does not have right now the ability to manufacture semiconductor, especially advanced semiconductor chips, silicon chips, all right? So then it means that China would like to acquire this. So this is a rivalry that is playing out. So US ने क्या किया? US banned the Dutch company from selling the foundries to China, right? फिर China ने क्या कहा? China issued its own technology program, all right? So in this particular context, what you will see is interest आपका ये होगा कि कब तक ये हो पाएगा. So people say that China would become self-sufficient in 10 years. अगर वो आपसे शुरू करता है, सो एडवांस सेमीकंडक्टर मैन्युफैक्चरिंग में उसको 10 साल लग जाएंगे, right, because of the limitations of the supply chains. But this will also play out in, for example, acquisition of IPR practices of China. All right, intellectual property rights practices of China. So US accuses China of either being involved in theft of intellectual property rights through the means of cybercrime, all right, hacking, or pressurizing US companies in handing it over or sharing with it their intellectual property rights. So this competition is playing out in this way also, right? US would try to contain the rise of China as much as possible, and China would like to rise as much as possible. So in economy, from trade to WTO to technology, this will play out, all right? And in security and defense also, right? So US defense spending is around much more than, some figures would say close to 800 billion US dollars, right? US dollars. China's defense spending, depending on the source, is calculated to be 212 to 270 billion US dollars. So again, this is the relationship between world's largest military spender and world's second largest military spender, right? So China would like to spend more, and US would like to maintain its military standing to the level where it is able to sustain its dominance, right? And then some people say development of weapons, for example, would be shaped by this competition. For example, 2018, Russia had announced new kinds of weapons that it has developed, right? Including supersonic weapons that it has developed, including an underwater drone that it has developed, which is nuclear capable. So competition also leads to development of weapons technology. So for example, people are saying that in development of tactical small nuclear weapons, China is already ahead of US, or development of delivery systems, development of ICBMs. China is closing the gap, right? So this would also be part of the competition, and then one major indicator would be development of naval power, right? And where would this competition play out? This competition would play out at places like, we would see it playing out in places like Taiwan, it playing out in places like South China Sea, right? To the extent we see this playing out in places like Taiwan, the question is not whether US would be able to defeat China, right? The question is, how important is it an issue for US? So for US, Taiwan is not a core issue. For China, Taiwan is a core issue. South China Sea is not the neighborhood of US. South China Sea is the neighborhood of China. To the extent that it is playing out here, it would be to the advantage of US. But if it starts playing out in, let's say, Europe, or if it starts playing out, let's say, in North America, Canada, जैसे मान लो कल को कनाडा में चाइना के इन्वेस्टमेंट बहुत ज़्यादा बढ़ने लगे, कल को चाइना कहे कि हम कनाडा में पोर्ट्स बनाएंगे, जैसे ग्वादार में पोर्ट चाइना बना रहा है. So then you can see that, you know, China has been able to sufficiently challenge the United States. So there is no doubt that China would continue to challenge United States. It would play out in terms of competition, rivalry. It would lead to development of technology or reshaping of technology supply chains. In advanced technology, it will play out in some geographies, right? Like Taiwan और साउथ चाइना सी. बट ये भी याद रखने की जरूरत है ना, ताइवान यूएस के लिए कोर इशू है, ना साउथ चाइना सी यूएस के लिए कोर इशू है. यहाँ पे यूएस का कुछ नहीं इमीडिएटली बिगड़ने वाला है, राइट? चाइना हैज मच एट स्टेक्स हियर, सो इट विल प्ले आउट हियर, राइट? मीनिंग वर्स्ट कम्स टू वर्स्ट, यूएस कैन एक्सेप्ट अ डिफीट ऑन द इशू ऑफ ताइवान और इवन ऑन साउथ चाइना सी, क्योंकि उसके इमीडिएट इंटरेस्ट आर नॉट गेटिंग affected. But what we are saying is that competition would play out here. Now this competition in terms of influence or leadership would play out at forums like G20, where neither US nor China have a clear dominance. It's a diverse group. Or it would be seen in terms of creation of newer institutions. What kind of institutions? China has created AIIB. All right, so it would play out at places like IMF as well. China would demand greater share, and reforms to a large extent depends on the view of US. So China would be interested in creating its own AIIB. All right, or globally, we so far have heard about the American dream. All right, great American dream. Now China is talking about rejuvenation of the Chinese dream. दोनों सपना देख रहे हैं. ऑल राइट, किसका सपना पूरा होगा ये हमको पता नहीं, लेकिन अपना सपना पूरा करने के लिए हर पावर क्या चाहता है, वो हेजेमॉन बनना चाहता है. ऑल राइट, सो दीज काइंड्स ऑफ कंपटीशन वुड प्ले आउट. सो चाइना के साथ एक शब्द आजकल जुड़ा हुआ है, वोल्फ वॉरियर डिप्लोमेसी. ये सब प्राइमरी चीजें नहीं है, ये बहुत अट्रैक्टिव लगती हैं. प्राइमरी वही है, कंपटीशन, कोऑपरेशन, कंटेंशन, कॉन्फ्लिक्ट. ऑल राइट, बाकी सब तो एग्जाम्पल है. Wolf warrior diplomacy. What is wolf warrior diplomacy? China adopting a much more stringent stance when it comes to its diplomacy, including being involved in coercive diplomacy. मतलब अब वो देशों को धमकी भी दे रहा है या जोर से बोलता है कि don't join Quad. For example, it said to Bangladesh, don't join Quad. So that is the reference. Wolf warrior diplomacy. That China's diplomacy has become much more outgoing. China's diplomacy has become much more aggressive. All right. So China would be using its diplomatic instruments also. US का काम कैसे बनता है दुनिया भर में? लोगों पे प्रेशर पुट करके. तो चाइना भी वही कर रहा होगा. So this is the kind of world that we are looking at. वहाँ पे भी वही सजेशन लागू होता है. Cooperate as much as you can, but avoid entanglements and have diverse options. Thereby, one area where we see all of these things playing out is the area of connectivity and infrastructure. All right, connectivity and infrastructure. अब यहाँ पे हम देखते हैं बहुत सिंपल से क्या है ये. So connectivity and infrastructure की जब हम बात करते हैं, so we find for example, we have for example goals like SDG 9. All right, goals like SDG 9, SDG 6. These are directly or indirectly linked with global infrastructure. That for global development, targets like SDG 9, SDG 6 are indicating towards the importance of development of infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure? It can be infrastructure like road, railway, transmission line, power networks, or it can be infrastructure like sanitation, water supply. All right. And for example, some people say that to achieve the what is called Agenda 2030. क्या है जनरली Agenda 2030 जब हम कहते हैं? Sustainable Development Goals. All right, Agenda 2030 का पार्ट है. बहुत सारे केसेस में हमने Agenda 2030 किया, बट ग्लोबली Agenda 2030 किससे एसोसिएटेड है? सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट गोल्स के साथ. 2030 तक ये गोल अचीव करने. If it has to be achieved, the investments which is required is $3 trillion annually, right? So people would say that at the current level there is a $350 billion gap in what is required and what is being done. And how is it being done? कहाँ से ये पैसा आता है? Right? First of all, whatever countries are spending on their own development, or they are borrowing from multilateral development bank, or they are borrowing from the private market through bonds, or they are getting the money from government to government cooperation in the form of ODA, right? Official Development Assistance. ये जितना भी पैसा है प्राइवेट, पब्लिक, अवेलेबल, कोऑपरेशन में अवेलेबल, बैंक से अवेलेबल, ये काफ़ी नहीं है इस तरह के रिक्वायरमेंट को पूरा करने के लिए. फॉर एग्जांपल इंडिया. अच्छा, ये नहीं जानते होगे तो इंडिया तो जानते ही होगे. इंडिया के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में कोई डेटा बता दो इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर कनेक्टिविटी का. गति शक्ति. क्या है गति शक्ति? Gati Shakti basically aims at providing gati, speed to approval. Project approval, project management में गति लाने का काम करेगा गति शक्ति. But why? क्यों? Because it is a no-brainer that for India to develop manufacturing or increase its economy to, let's say, our goal is 5 trillion. अगर 5 ट्रिलियन यूएस डॉलर की इकोनॉमी बनना है तो हमें 2024-25 तक 1.4 ट्रिलियन यूएस डॉलर इन्वेस्ट करना होगा अपने इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर में. कौन कहता है? इकोनॉमिक सर्वे. All right, if you read economic survey you can find this data also. All right, that if India wants to become a $5 trillion economy, it needs to spend 1.4 trillion US dollars in infrastructure. All right, कनेक्टिविटी में क्या बन रहा है? इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर ही तो बन रहा है, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर प्रोजेक्ट्स बन रहे हैं. तो दुनिया भर में ये बात है. सिमिलरली फॉर एग्जांपल बहुत सारे लोग मैकिन्से या फिर वर्ल्ड इकोनॉमिक फोरम, इनकी रिपोर्ट आती है. वर्ल्ड इकोनॉमिक फोरम कहता है कि 14 ट्रिलियन यूएस डॉलर्स की रिक्वायरमेंट होगी ग्लोबल डेवलपमेंट, दुनिया भर के देशों की जो डेवलपमेंट की रिक्वायरमेंट है उसको पूरा करने के लिए, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर में इन्वेस्टमेंट के लिए. राइट. सिमिलरली मैकिन्से भी मोरलेस इसी तरह की बात करता है, आईएमएफ भी मोरलेस इसी तरह की बात करता है कि जरूरत है, देयर इज रिक्वायरमेंट ऑफ हाई अमाउंट ऑफ इन्वेस्टमेंट बट देयर इज अ शॉर्ट फॉल. कंट्रीज नीड इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर but that would require large investments, and thereby what we see is on the basis of this requirement China launched Belt and Road Initiative. ये वो चीज़ें हैं जिनके बारे में मैं कभी ना कभी बात कर चुका हूँ. इसमें से कुछ भी नया मैं नहीं कह रहा हूँ, डेटा को छोड़ के कुछ भी नया यूज़ नहीं कर रहा हूँ मैं. कनेक्टिविटी के बारे में मैंने बात की थी, बीआरआई के बारे में चाइना के समय कर चुके हैं ये सारी बातें. अच्छा, तो चलिए बीआरआई को आपको पता है बीआरआई क्या है, ये सब नहीं बात की थी ना, तो अब ये जोड़ सकते हो ना. बीआरआई इज चाइनाज एम्बिशियस प्रोजेक्ट टू प्रमोट इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर. इट हैज 2 legs. One is the Silk Route economic belt, which basically is land-based routes, infrastructure being created largely in Eurasia. And another is maritime Silk Road, which is basically its program to invest in maritime infrastructure. So it is Chinese ambitious project. It is closely associated with the presidency of Xi Jinping, जिनको अब आगे और एक्सटेंशन मिलने वाला है. राइट. एंड इट इज पार्ट ऑफ चाइनाज लार्जर ग्लोबल इकोनॉमिक स्ट्रैटेजी. राइट. सो कोई भी देश ऐसे आंख बंद करके कुछ नहीं कर रहा है. चाइना नोज दैट देयर इज अ रिक्वायरमेंट एंड इफ इट ऑफर्स द सॉल्यूशन इट बिकम्स अट्रैक्टिव. कंट्रीज, लोगों को बातचीत से ज्यादा ये चाहिए कि पैसा कहां से आएगा, घर में रोटी कहां से आएगी, ये ज्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट है. सिद्धांत के बारे में बाद में बात कर लेंगे. So China has launched Belt and Road Initiative in this context, right? And then some countries are opposed to BRI. क्यों? For example, India, that because it violates principles like sovereignty and territorial integrity. That is our number one grouch against the BRI, right? And then a principled criticism has developed over the years. But on the basis of views of countries like India, US, Australia, Japan, right? You see a principled opposition has developed, right? So for example, Chinese BRI is criticized for violation of principles like sovereignty and territorial integrity, not adhering by principles of good governance. For example, not involving ideas like competitive bidding इस इन प्रोजेक्ट्स में नहीं है. सो दैट्स व्हाई इट इज अगेंस्ट गुड गवर्नेंस प्रैक्टिसेस, गुड business practices. All right, so that is the criticism that is developing. The criticism is developing that it is unilateral, that this project is unilateral and non-consultative. The criticism is developing that this project, meaning Chinese BRI, involves unsustainable economic practices, meaning the accusation that this involves ideas like predatory lending practices, or it is enhancing, बात करने के बजाय यहाँ देख लो या वहाँ देख लो उस स्क्रीन पे, enhancing debt trap. अगर मैं ये बता चुका हूँ तो मुझे बता देना. हो चुका है? ये नहीं बताया था? कुछ लोगों का कहना है यस सर, कुछ लोगों का कहना है नो सर. चाइना पढ़ाया तो बता दिया था सब कुछ पूरा. आगे क्या बताया था जरा मुझे बता दो, अपने नोट से अंदाजा दिला दो. तो मैं यहाँ पे रोक देता हूँ इसको, फिर अफ्रीका शुरू कर देता हूँ. एक बार मुझे बता दो, 2-3 बैचेस एक साथ चल रहे हैं, तो ये बात हुई है या नहीं हुई है? क्या बताया था इसके आगे? सो इसमें ब्लू डॉट नेटवर्क हो गया है, ब्लू डॉट नेटवर्क लिखा था. ओके, बिल्ड बैक बेटर लिखा था, पीजीआईआई लिखा था, पीजीआईआई भी किया था इसमें, पीजीआईआई भी किया हुआ है. वेरी गुड. तो इसका मतलब ये है कि नाउ यू कैन लुक एट दिस इशू as an issue involving China, an issue in which India has a concern, an issue in which there are global developments which are taking place. तो यही तो मैं पूछ रहा था, ये बात हुई है या नहीं हुई है. तो यूएस के साथ बात करने पे अंत में हम अगेन फिर से देख सकते हैं कि मान लो यूपीएससी एक क्वेश्चन पूछता है, किस बारे में क्वेश्चन पूछता है? यूएस चाइना के कॉम्पिटिशन में पूछ लिया है. मान लो एक क्वेश्चन पूछता है कनेक्टिविटी competition in the world, or connectivity as an area of prospective engagement between India and United States. You would apply your mind and bring in both aspects that we have learned from in relation with China and what we have learned in the relation with United States. All right, ये दोनों चीजें आप करेंगे. पक्का सबके पास है ना? बात कर चुके हैं हम. How has this developed, right? ओके, सो आई वॉज जस्ट अंडर द इम्प्रेशन कि इस बैच में शायद मैंने वो बात नहीं की है. तो बात अगर कर ली है तब तो बहुत बढ़िया. तो बीआरआई अब आपको लार्जर कॉन्टेक्स्ट में भी समझ में आ गया. अब हम किस बारे में बात करेंगे? इंडिया एंड अफ्रीका. ऑल राइट, इंडिया एंड अफ्रीका. लेट्स टॉक अबाउट इंडिया एंड अफ्रीका. नाउ वो डेटा लिख लिया आपने? वो डेटा भी लिखवाया था पहले मैंने. इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर इन्वेस्टमेंट का जितना गैप है वो था पहले वाले में. देख के मुझे एक बार बता दो. है? ये सारी बातें हैं जो शुरू में भी जो की है. शुरू में क्या बातें की हैं? एसडीजी, सम एसडीजीज कंप्लीटेड, ग्लोबल एफर्ट्स, ये सारी चीजें कंप्लीटेड ना? अच्छा, ये शरणवीर भी कह रहे हैं कि कंप्लीटेड. ठीक है, नाउ आई टेक इट दैट इट इज कंप्लीटेड. ओके, इट मींस ओके. चलिए, सो व्हेन वी टॉक अबाउट इंडिया एंड अफ्रीका रिलेशंस, वी आर जनरली लुकिंग इनटू Africa as a region because of certain factors. What kind of factors? So if you see, Africa's population totally is around 1.3 billion. The size of its economy is around 3 trillion. All right, and Africa has 55 countries out of which 54 are member of the UN. All right. And thereby, we also know that Africa has 30% of untapped global mineral resources. All right. And Africa has around 60% of remaining cultivable land. All right, land which can be brought under cultivation or where cultivation can be enhanced. Right. Some sources argue that by 2030, the 25%, a quarter of global demand would come from Africa, meaning Africa would be a prospective market in the future. So when we talk about relations with Africa, we are looking at this potential, that Africa is a resource-rich continent. Africa is a continent where the level of industrial growth has been low. So thereby Africa is a continent with high growth potential, right? Africa is going to be an important interest in global economic development in the future. For example, 2030, the market, global market demand, 25% of it would come from Africa, right? So these are the things that not only us in India, we in India keep in mind, but also the world is aware of it, right? So that's why Africa is known as, some people would say, last remaining El Dorado. El Dorado is a reference to city of gold, a mythical city of gold about which the Spanish had heard, and that's where they went searching for it in South America. पर क्या किया उन्होंने South America में? They spread smallpox. They wiped out indigenous community, right? So El Dorado is simply is a reference to untapped nature of Africa's resources, opportunities in Africa, growth opportunities in Africa. And thereby we see that this relationship is based on, we can say that this is based on historical affinity, that India and Africa have historical affinity. All right. Historical affinity, which means what? That geographically they have been connected by the Indian Ocean. So thereby connections between India's west coast and Africa's east coast, right? We can say that some trade in the ancient times also existed. So thereby we can say that communities like Siddhi are an example of this connect, movement between Africa and India. Siddhi community found in Gujarat, for example, but you will also find the African community in Karnataka, right? People from Africa came and now they have been living in this area, right? और बहुत सारे लोग गोंडवाना लैंड में भी चले जा सकते हैं, मतलब कि the whole idea of continental drift, all right? So before continental drift actualized, these were fused land masses, all right? India, Africa, large part of this land mass, and then they separated, but they are linked by the Indian Ocean. But we say that historical affinity. The second way of looking at historical affinity would be common experience. What kind of common experience? Colonialism. All right. They shared experience in terms of common colonial experience, which meant what? Which meant a commonality of values. For example, efforts in the area of decolonization. So India acted as the voice of African countries, and India chaired the decolonization committee of the UN. All right. So India was the first chair of the decolonization committee of the UN, and thereby this solidarity is there. And we see that's why 1960s is called decade of Africa, because of number of countries from Africa became independent and became a part of the United Nations. And in this, India plays a leading role, advocating decolonization, chairing the decolonization committee, sponsoring a resolution for national self-determination of these countries, or after independence of these countries, contributing to stability in these countries, UN peacekeeping missions. For example, initial UN peacekeeping missions in Congo. At that point in time, Belgian Congo. India was involved, all right? And even now, in peacekeeping missions in Africa, India is involved, right? So this we are talking about initial period of peacekeeping missions. So India not only advocated independence of these countries, but when these countries faced instability, because all of them were coming out of a colonial experience without having a previous experience of being a nation state. So the borders in this region were drawn in such a way that either major communities were divided, ethnic communities, or different ethnic communities were put under same polity, within the boundaries of same polity. So there were a lot of ethnic conflicts, domestic conflicts that erupted in Africa, and international community, UN, made an effort to stabilize it, and India contributed to those efforts. Similarly, you will see from this period, you have shared heritage in terms of, let's say, Mahatma Gandhi spending time in Africa. All right, Mahatma Gandhi spending time in Africa, and thereby Mahatma Gandhi becoming in some ways inspiring figure for the major figures of Africa itself, Nelson Mandela, or the African National Congress, right? So Mahatma Gandhi, some people would say Gandhi became Mahatma, or Mohandas became Mahatma only after spending time in Africa, because there he honed the skills that he then applied in India, right, or methods. So this is the common experience that they have. But you will also see that one of the key aspects in this period is also movement of people. So the Britishers took Indians as endangered laborers to work in infrastructure projects in eastern part of Africa, for example, the Kenyan Railway, or to work in South Africa. So thereby today, we have around 3 million people of Indian origin living in Africa. So that is also part of this historic engagement that we had. People moved from India to Africa, right? So currently, 3 million people of Indian origin. And now if we see, many of the countries of Africa adopted the same foreign policy approach, and thereby solidarity in terms of preference for non-alignment or partnership in the leadership of NAM. For example, Ghana, all right? There was a Ghanaian leader called Kwame Nkrumah, all right? Nkrumah of Ghana, right? So Prime Minister Nehru from India, Colonel Nasser from Egypt, Sukarno from Indonesia, right? Marshal Tito from Yugoslavia, and to a large extent, Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana. These were the leading figures in the initial period of non-alignment. So this is what it is based on. Historical affinity, which leads to cultural affinity, which leads to common factors, common experiences, and India's contribution. Now if we look at this cooperation in today's time, we see that it is based on what we can call as complementarity, and this complementarity is built on similarities. So it is a relationship of complementarities and similarities. What kind of similarities, right? Similarities in terms of development challenges or priorities, all right? So for example, till recently, India was #1 country in terms of number of absolute poor. Now that crown is on the head of Nigeria, all right? Nigeria has the highest number of poor people in terms of absolute number, right? So poverty is common. Or you see, if you look at our sociological challenges in terms of development, urbanization. Urbanization is picking up on both sides, right? So for example, a few years back, a World Bank report said that urbanization in India is messy and hidden, all right? Meaning it is unorganized. Cities are expanding, but you will see cities are expanding in an unorganized way, whereas urbanization is an important phenomenon, meaning simply that people are moving in large numbers from rural areas to urban areas. So that's why earlier the narrative was that India is a country of 600,000 villages. India lives in villages. Now more and more we think about cities also, right? The proportion of population to cities is increasing. So urbanization, and then requirement for industrialization. We may be ahead of Africa. We are not saying that it's same, but we still have large number of poor people. So anti-poverty programs addressing poverty is still a challenge for India, and so is it for Africa. Urbanization, for good or for bad, it is taking place. Large number of people now are moving towards cities. It has to be managed. Industrialization, for example, both India and Africa lagged in industrialization because of factors like colonialism, right? And thereby low level of manufacturing as part of their economy. So these are our, what we can call, similarities. And there is also complementarity. For example, people argue, or we can argue, that solutions for India or India's problems, or let's say India's challenges, are relevant for Africa. All right, are relevant for Africa. Meaning if we can find a solution which works for us, given the similar circumstances, it may also work for Africa. Some people say India's spirit of Jugaad. All right, India's spirit of Jugaad is relevant for Africa. Why? Because Jugaad in simple terms is frugal innovation. All right, not large scale R&D investments and then years of research and development. जो भी है उसके आधार पे solutions निकालो, right? So India's spirit of Jugaad is also relevant for Africa. Frugal innovation also applicable for Africa, right? India can be a partner for Africa, so there is enough scope for development partnership. India can share its experience with Africa, and India can also then help in the capacity building of Africa and African states, right? This is something that can also be done. So thereby we see that these examples are here. For example, India's pharma sector has been an important support in fighting pandemics like AIDS in Africa, right? Meaning Indian generic pharmaceutical sector was important in lowering the prices of life-saving drugs to combat diseases like AIDS, all right, or even cancer treatment. And then in recent times, India's assistance to Africa in terms of Ebola outbreak. All right, so before COVID-19, the last major outbreak of a contagious disease that the world faced was Ebola. And in that time also we had the experience that people coming from West Africa, for example, were monitored at the airports, right? So that awareness was there. But ये awareness इतना बड़े form में आ जाएगा COVID-19 के ये कोई नहीं समझता था. But we had the experience that something like Ebola had happened. So India helped in this particular period also, and that is why India is called pharmacy of the world, right? Because Indian pharmaceutical sector is a provider of cheap medication to other countries. Now this complementarity can also be seen from other sides, right? So Africa has a large emerging market which is attractive to India. Africa has significant energy resources. All right, energy resources, for example, the simple example would be petroleum. All right, Angola, or Nigeria, these are important, or Sudan, these are important petroleum producers in Africa. And traditionally, 10% of India's petroleum import, 10% of India's petroleum imports have been from Africa. 10% of India's petroleum imports have come from Africa. So not only India fulfilling Africa's needs, but Africa also is an important partner in fulfilling India needs. For example, rare earth minerals, places like Congo, all right, are considered to be important for the future of rare earth mineral in general Africa. So India, if it wants to grow, it would have to secure energy supplies, it would have to secure mineral supply. There, Africa can fulfill India's need. And this relationship can only be balanced if the needs of both sides, meaning we can say that thereby the effort is to develop a relationship based on mutual benefit. Meaning India fulfilling Africa's needs either by providing technology or capacity building support or support in the area of healthcare, and Africa fulfilling India's needs in terms of market, energy resources, right? And in turn, this partnership focuses on capacity building of African states. So that's what we see generally as defining features of India-Africa relations right now. Now, if we look at it closely, what we see is this, that India has initiated certain programs. For example, the IAFS. IAFS is India-Africa Forum Summit meeting. So India-Africa Forum Summit meeting is the highest multilateral platform at the government to government level. All right. So for example, the IAFS started in 2008. It took place in 2008 in New Delhi. Then the second edition of IAFS took place in 2011 in Addis Ababa, which is the capital of Ethiopia. And the third edition, the latest one, took place in 2015, again in New Delhi. All right. So this is the largest multilateral platform that we have launched, platform for dialogue where initiatives are also announced in the context of Africa. IAFS is India-Africa Forum Summit. 2008 New Delhi, 11 Addis Ababa, 15 again New Delhi, the Forum Summit has taken place. So this is where major initiatives are announced. If you are reading newspaper, you will find this year, for example, the Exim Bank of India and the African Development Bank hosted an India-Africa Growth Partnership conclave, in which multiple finance ministers from Africa participated, including an address by India's foreign minister. All right. So Exim Bank of India and the African Development Bank. So these kinds of initiatives also exist where there is an effort to build a dialogue or focus on areas of cooperation like economy and trade. Right. Now if you see the cooperation in the area of economy or economic engagements, we find that there has been high rate of growth in trade between India and Africa. So thereby you will see, for example, 2021 India-Africa trade grew to $89 billion dollars. All right, 89 billion US dollars. If we see in cumulative terms, India is the third largest trading partner, fourth largest trading partner of Africa, India. And if you see Africa, if you look at cumulative number, emerges as third largest trade partner for India, right? Similarly, Africa is, if you look at it as a common market, third largest export destination, for India. Meaning trade has grown. It has shown high numbers, 89 billion US dollars of trade 2021, which makes India fourth largest trading partner of Africa. Generally, it is after China, European Union, US. All right. So India is the fourth largest trading partner. And Africa, if you look at cumulative numbers, is the third largest trade partner of India. And for India, it is the third largest export destination as well. So there has been growth in trade. But what we see is that it is comparatively lower than other countries like China. China's trade in the same period with Africa is close to 250 billion US dollars, right? So sometimes what is raised is comparative position of India, right? The other issue is that some experts argue that the trade can become double. For example, Exim Bank of India study said that trade could have become double trade can double by taking adequate measures. If both sides take adequate measures, the current trade can increase by double. All right. So then we identify what kind of steps. So if you see that India and Africa have a limited trade basket. All right. So for example, pharmaceuticals, refined petroleum are major exports of India. This covers for more than 75% of India-Africa trade, pharmaceutical, refined petroleum. All right. And generally, African exports to India are raw material. All right. Raw material. So limited nature of trade basket is one challenge. So the solution is, what is required is India and Africa should diversify the trade. All right. Diversify the trade basket, right? Include more number of traded goods. Secondly, the trade need to be balanced. So thereby the effort should be capacity building of African states in manufacturing. All right. So that means, for example, what we can do is closer cooperation, and we are doing it also, closer cooperation in the MSME sector. If not large industries, that's certainly MSME sector, so that this trade becomes balanced, so that Africa also is able to export to India value added goods, which India is right now doing, right? Then we say working on infrastructure and connectivity, right? So that that kind of investment both in India and Africa would be helpful in doubling the trade. So thereby we have initiatives in India like the Sagarmala initiative. All right. And thereby we can also think of Asia Africa Growth Corridor in partnership with Japan in Africa, right? And then some people say that trade finance support to Africa or African entrepreneurs, African businesses would also double the trade between India and Africa. AGC is Asia Africa Growth Corridor. All right. And then we say that creating awareness on changing rules as well as emerging opportunities, will go a long way in improving India-Africa trade, which means we had seen earlier example of Exim Bank and African Development Bank holding an India-Africa Growth Partnership conclave meeting, right, in which various ministers participated. So awareness about rules and procedures in India, in Africa, which may be changing, as well as adequate advertisement of opportunities available in India and Africa. If this is done, then India-Africa trade would grow. And then ultimately Africa has undertaken the procedure of integration in the area of economy, right? So we have seen the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has been launched in 2022. All right. So African countries are in the process of creating world's largest free trade area by number of countries, right? Prospectively, 54 countries of Africa would be part of what is called African Continental Free Trade Area as part of African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So this unification of African economies would help in the development of Africa, but also would aid the prospects of India-Africa trade. And how can we do that? By signing a free trade agreement or working for a free trade agreement with the African Continental Free Trade Area countries, right? So just as ASEAN is based on a free trade agreement between its countries, so it acts as one trade interlocutor. European Union is one trade market. Now Africa is also in the process of creating its own unified market under the African Continental Free Trade Area. All right, post listening station at Madagascar. ये कहाँ से आ गया? All right. So this is how you can improve trade with Africa, right? Now the second area is the area of investments. All right, investments. So India's cumulative investments to Africa have also risen to around 79 billion US dollars, and I'm simply using the numbers given by the foreign minister in that conclave. And thereby India now is in top 5 investors in Africa. All right, top 5 investors in Africa. And if we see India's development assistance to Africa also stands at around 11 billion US dollars, right? If we look at the line of credits that India has offered to Africa. So this is the highest line of credit in terms of a region where line of credits have been given, right? So India's development assistance in Africa is also increasing, plus its cumulative investment in terms of, for example, Indian companies like Airtel, Mahindra, Tata, right? And many companies in the agri-tech sector are present in African markets, right? For example, Airtel would be one of the leading telecom providers in African market. So that is also increasing. But here also what we say is this, that China has a much larger investment presence in Africa, right? Similarly, interests in Africa are not only limited to China or India. European Union, USA, Japan, all these large economies are focusing on Africa because of the prospects, as we talked about, right? So thereby what we see is this, that overall we should learn from Chinese investments and its experience. So Chinese investments seem to be large, but there are criticisms associated with Chinese investments in Africa. What kind of criticism? One, that Chinese investments don't generate local employment. Adequate local employment is not generated by Chinese investments. Two, we see that much of Chinese investments is repatriated, meaning what China gives, what China giveth, China taketh. All right, what China gives ends up eventually in China, meaning China brings its own labor. Thereby much of Chinese investments in Africa are repatriated, right? Chinese investments then are also accused of promoting corruption and violation of local rules, all right, and environmental standards, all right, local rules and environmental standards. So that is what also is associated with Chinese investments. It is more than what India invests in Africa, but it is also then developing a pattern where it is seen critically. Many governments in Africa have criticized that Chinese aate hain, Chinese jate hi nahi hai. All right, there has been violence against Chinese. For example, in Zambia, Zimbabwe, there has been violence against Chinese personnel. So India should learn from China's investment pattern and thereby present its own counter model, right? So that's why we say India should focus on investments which are essential for capacity building. It is not necessary that you build fancy airport, right? That is what China does, builds ports, airports. But ports and airports, who does require it? Ultimately, they prove to be, if there is not adequate economic development, they prove to be white elephants, right? So many African countries are facing that. So investment should be ones which focus on capacity building, right? They should be ones which generate employment. They should be ones based on use of ICT to focus on development of services sector in Africa. Because if you see general traditional development trajectory is considered to be countries first developing manufacturing, then developing services. In the case of India, it is reversed, all right? Our services has expanded much more early on, relatively early on in our development as compared to manufacturing. Africa also is such an example. The task of developing industrial infrastructure in Africa is a long-term task. But what we see is Africa has young population, just as India has young population. What you also see is that ICT, meaning for example, हमारे यहाँ या कहीं पे भी, generally Africa में भी लोगों के पास कुछ हो चाहे नहीं हो, क्या होगा, एक मोबाइल फोन होगा और उसमें डेटा का रिचार्ज होगा. All right, so that means this is an opportunity. People like Bill Gates are talking about it, developing solutions to these needs. या फिर फिक्स्ड फॉर्मूला पे नहीं सोचना कि ऐसे ही डेवलप होगा. भाई मोबाइल टेलीफोनी है, population है which is using mobile telephony, then develop payment systems. All right, so develop what is called knowledge economy, services sector and knowledge economy. So that's why you will see, for example, India has its own JAM Trinity. All right, Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile Trinity. This is basically a product of knowledge economy, right? Whether you are educated, not educated, doesn't matter. Mobile phone कोई भी चला लेता है, right? पढ़े लिखे होने से कोई रिलेशन नहीं है. भाई मुझसे अच्छा मोबाइल फ़ोन बहुत सारे लोगों के पास होगा, राइट? जबकि मैं पढ़ता हूँ, मेरे पास एम्प्लॉयमेंट भी है, लेकिन आई नो दैट younger people are much more adept at using that technology. So that is something that is an economic opportunity for developing knowledge economy based on the existing knowledge of the requirements of the society and technological achievements of the society. So that is what India should be focusing on. This is what India is also doing. All right. So for example, India's capacity building support is seen in, for example, in IIFS, India announced that it would be offering in the coming future $10 billion of assistance, $10 billion of assistance to African countries. Then India said that a India Africa Health Fund would be created. India Africa Health Fund. So India said that initially $10 million of grant for this particular fund. So India Africa Health Fund, right? And then India has also said that in this phase of development assistance, India would be providing 50,000 scholarships, 50,000 scholarships to African, 50,000 scholarships to African students. All right. So this is the meaning of capacity building support. Announcing financial support, which would be helpful in building infrastructure, school buildings, small irrigation systems. अगर एक छोटा सा एग्रीकल्चर सिस्टम आप बिल्ड कर दें, तो किसान को पता होता है कि पिछले साल उसकी ज़मीन पे खेती नहीं हुई थी, इस साल हुई. So these kinds of projects bring about immediate change in the life and livelihood opportunities of the local community. Not a large airport or port by necessity. So these kinds of projects are being implemented by India, right? Then setting up of India Africa Health Fund, focusing on areas like health. This is capacity building. Then scholarship to students, focusing on education. This is capacity building. All happening in the context of India's own development support. Then we say ICT, use of ICT to develop knowledge economy. So India already launched a Pan-Africa e-network. All right, Pan-Africa e-network project. All right, Pan-Africa e-network project has been launched by India in 2009. Currently, 43 African countries are part of this initiative. This initiative basically promotes teleeducation and cooperation in telemedicine, right? So basically through a network of satellite connectivity, broadband connectivity, Indian institutions are relaying lectures which are beneficial for African students, including lectures from medical colleges, right? Telemedicine consultations, so Indian hospitals linked with institutions in Africa, right? And it was generally the idea of Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, right? And the second phase of this was launched by the government in 2019. So thereby we now have schemes like e-Arogyashree, which is basically a healthcare initiative, and Vidya Bharati. All right. E-Vidya Bharati initiative that we have launched to benefit Africa in terms of education. All right. So these are part of how we are using ICT, information communication technology, to link with Africa. This is the development assistance taking shape in the case of Africa. All right. This is where we will stop. You are free to go. In the next class, next 2 classes, I have asked for 2 more classes with you. We will complete IR in terms of Africa is done, West Asia and diaspora. Right? After Africa, West Asia diaspora we will take as one, and then organization as another.